Since the second half of September, the weather had not spoiled us. Just when the sky lightened up a little, you would see that the clouds had covered the horizon again. German aviation in such weather acted by single bombers. The enemy did not expect that our aviation in such weather can appear in the air. In the book of Hitler's General Guderian, Memories of a Soldier, has such an explanation. In September, wrote Guderian, the German troops suffered heavy losses in the raids of enemy aircraft, against which it was impossible to organize the necessary cover, because the Russian aviation operated from airfields located in the zone of good weather, and our airfields were in the zone of unfavorable weather, and on this rainy day our planes did not have the opportunity to take to the air. That's it. According to Guderian, it turned out that all the matter is that in our zone there was no rain, but the Germans, because of it, could not take off. The facts refute this brazen lie. The weather in the area of our airfields was no better, if not worse, than in the areas where the Nazi aviation was based. But Hitler's generals, if things were not in their favour, tried to find various objective reasons to justify their blunders. In this case, they saw this reason in unfavourable weather. And the truth is that the Soviet pilots, fighting for the motherland, boundlessly believing in the rightness of their holy cause, went into battle in any weather and bravely conducted combat operations even in extremely difficult meteorological conditions. The aviation of the Bryansk front dealt powerful blows to the enemy grouping of Guderian. There were persistent battles in Roslavel and Pochep-Starodub directions. Our aviation rendered great help to the ground troops, especially the fearless IL-2 attack aircrafts were distinguished. By delivering powerful blows to the enemy troops, they made them trample on one place. The enemy was regrouping troops. In connection with this sharply increased opposition from his aircraft and anti-aircraft guns, and our aviation, as well as the enemy aviation, suffered serious losses. The load for each pilot was maximum, as the number of tasks and objects of defeat increased. Of particular importance in these conditions was intelligence. It was necessary to reveal the dislocation of units, the grouping of the enemy. The squadron commander Major Trilevich called me and Junior Lieutenant Sibirin to the CP and ordered to reconnoitre enemy airfields in the areas of Seshcha, Roslavel, Krychev at dawn. Having laid out the route and defined the flight profile, we flew on the mission. We crossed the front line at extremely low altitude, unnoticeably approached the enemy airfield, but here we were met with rather dense anti-aircraft fire. It's not for nothing, flashed a thought, and we, manoeuvring, continued the flight. Black clouds of bursts, it seemed, sought not only to hit us, but also to cover the ground from our eyes. The Germans did not spare shells, but our MiGs, as if rounding the ruptures and, despite the enemy fire, came to the airfield. It was worth looking at it, as immediately became clear why the Nazis so strongly covered the approaches to it with anti-aircraft artillery. Below stood dozens of Junkers, and to the runway felling Messers. There were at least 40 bombers and a dozen or two fighters on the airfield. About everything that we saw immediately radioed to the command centre of the regiment. Nowadays, pilots do not see any problem in radio transmission of information from their airplane to the control centre. It is quite natural and habitual. But in September 1941, we had just begun to master the radio. Before the war, as I have already said, the radio in fighter aviation was almost never used, and even flying on MiGs, we have long used it only for negotiations between the crews in the air. In these days we were announced a telegram received in the name of the Air Force Command of the Bryansk Front from the chairman of the State Defense Committee, Stalin. It praised the actions of the aviation of the Bryansk Front, but at the same time pointed out that the success would be even more significant if the scouts would call bombers and attackers by radio, and not after returning to the airfield, as we old-fashioned continued to do. This instruction forced us to take a new look at the possibilities of radio communication, and very soon we were convinced of the effect of a quick report to the command about the results of reconnaissance. While continuing the flight, we detected the movement of enemy vehicles on the highway Krikev-Roslavl. The report about it was immediately sent to the air. When we returned to our airfield, the squadron was no longer at the airfield. It was headed by Major Trilevich flew out to attack the object we had indicated. We with Sibirin, after the preparation of their aircraft, should be ready to take off to cover the landing of aircraft returning from the assault. The last days of September were very tense. During the day, each pilot made 10-12 combat sorties. There was no time even to shave. And now, while technicians Kalamuzin and Korolev were preparing airplanes for a second flight, I decided to tidy up. The weather was unusually favourable. After long rains, the sun finally looked out, warmed up considerably. I settled down at the airplane, in the Kaponier, but I could not shave. To the airfield is a link of U-88, said over the phone Squadron Commissar Fedorov. The plane is ready, Comrade Commander, said Korolev. He wiped soapy foam off his face with a towel, quickly took a seat in the cockpit, started the engine and took off. My technician and mechanic hurried to Sibirin's plane to speed up its takeoff. While in the air, I am alone. But we can't wait. I see the fascists are coming in a dense formation to Bryansk. In a cloudless sky with excellent visibility, of course, they noticed me, but obviously did not pay attention. In any case, my attack was unexpected for them. It's a strange thing. When you go up in the air and have not yet seen the enemy, then willy-nilly nervous, feeling a sense of constraint, there is nothing worse than the unknown. And guess where the enemy may pop up from which side you will be attacked. It is impossible. So you twist your head, you look around, you worry. But then the enemy is detected. There's no trace of anxiety left. Now there's nothing to worry about. There's no need to wait for an unexpected attack. The enemy is here. And all thoughts will. Everything is directed to destroy him. Quickly, or rather instantly make a decision. Act calmly, calculatingly, confidently. Then, after the battle, when the picture of the recent past will again float in the mind, more than once a chill will run down the skin. But in battle, at the cost of colossal nervous tension, you keep yourself in control. Even now, although it's been 25 years, remembering that trouble, I have an unpleasant feeling. And then, in the battle, clamped in a fist nerves, gathering the will, resolutely went forward. On a countercourse, at an angle of 15-20 degrees, I hit the left-wing man, and the first cue ignited Junkers 88. The other two enemy planes, shooting back and manoeuvring, continued to fly. The fight was only getting hotter. For the death of Sasha, you will pay in full, gritted through his teeth, rapidly pursuing the Nazi bombers, and was already close to the target when I saw another link of U-88, marching in a dense formation. The enemy was very close, and I decided to attack from the start. I again directed the blow to one of the wingmen, but these fascists were not so careless as those against whom I made the first attack. All three bombers opened fire. I felt how the bullets cut into the wings of my fighter, but I continued to get closer and from an extremely short distance opened fire. He was more accurate. Junkers burst into flames and went to the ground, just in case I decided to fire another line into it. But then a trio of suddenly appeared Messerschmitts rushed at me. However, the Nazi pilots acted somehow constrained, and this allowed me not only to get out from under the blow, but also to seize the initiative. I didn't think of leaving the battle. All thoughts were directed to one thing, to fight until the fuel runs out. A machine gun line pierced one Me-109. The Nazi fighter turned west, and immediately I went into the tail of the second Messerschmitt. He rushed into a dive, but my MiG followed him relentlessly. The silhouette of the enemy airplane was clearly visible in the sight. I pressed the throttles. Machine guns are silent, quickly reloading weapons, but still no fire. Tearfully offended that the enemy will leave. By a combat turn at maximum speed, I gain altitude and notice below me, flying towards the front, Junkers 88. This one will not go away. So what if it ran out of ammunition? Soviet pilots have another formidable weapon, a ram. Manoeuvring, I go into the tail of the Nazi bomber to cut it with a propeller. The distance between the MiG and the Junkers is rapidly shrinking. Air gunners U-88 are firing furiously. Tracks dash the air next to my plane, and the gap is getting smaller and smaller. 100 metres, 50, 20, 10. 5 remains to the tail of the Junkers. And suddenly MiG trembled like a living creature. Blood appeared on my hands. I took the handle and consciousness fell into the abyss. Fortunately, I came to my senses very soon. It was as if blacksmiths were working in my head. My eyes are foggy. The airplane is plummeting to the ground. The cabin is engulfed in flames. I'm trying to take the fighter out of dive, but it does not obey. There's only one way out. Gathering all my strength, I open the cockpit lantern and leave the plane. The fall is replaced by a smooth descent. Having swallowed the smoke in the cockpit, I can't catch my breath. Greedily, like a fish thrown on the shore, I grab air. Then I look around. My left leg is covered in blood, but immediately my thoughts are interrupted by the whistle of bullets. A Messerschmitt 109 dive-bombing me. Maybe it is one of those with whom I had just had a fight, and now, seeing my helplessness, he decided to get even. It's in the nature of Hitler's vultures. Curses come out of my mouth. But words, even the strongest ones, can't stop the fascist. I try to speed up the descent and for this purpose pull the straps of the parachute, but my strength is not enough. From the tension, I lose consciousness. I woke up on the ground, and the first thing I heard was someone's joyful exclamation. Alive! Indeed, alive! But I was being dive-bombed by an Me-109, and a wounded pilot descending by parachute is a perfect target. And yet I'm still alive. The infantrymen who watched the battle from the ground, in whose location I landed, tell me that as soon as the enemy plane started dive-bombing me, our other fighter plane, which took to the air a little later, rushed at the enemy, went into his tail, and killed the vile vulture. When Sibirin came to me in the hospital to find out how he was feeling, I shook his hand in silence for a long, long time, and he, embarrassed, quietly said, "Come on, Kolya. Wouldn't you or any of our guys do the same? I landed 30 kilometers from the airfield." The infantrymen immediately took out their individual packs and, having treated my wound as much as possible, bandaged me up. They did their best to relieve my condition. I thanked them sincerely for their help. And then I heard the words that still ring in my ears. "You pilots," said an elderly soldier in a scorched overcoat, "help us by destroying their planes. You don't even know with what hope we look at each of our planes. Only those who have been under bombardment know the true value of their pilots." I thought about these words many times during the war. I often remember them now. Yes, the people, having armed us with mighty airplanes, laid a huge responsibility on the air fighters, and we have no right to forget about it. I thought a lot about the words of the soldier, and in the infirmary, where I was placed after being wounded. At our regiment was deployed a small hospital, which served the entire division. It was headed by a military doctor of the second rank, Berdalov. As soon as I was brought to the hospital, the doctor immediately began the operation. That day, my condition was severe. In the evening, the division commander, General Klevtsov, came to the infirmary. "How are you, Comrade Kozlov?" he asked, coming to my bed. "Everything is fine, Comrade General." The doctor, standing opposite the commander, on the other side of the bunk, expressively pointed to his watch. The general understood his gesture and nodded his head. "I won't bore you, Comrade Kozlov. I congratulate you on your victory. Thank you for the courage and skill shown in today's battle. The command has decided to present you to the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. I'm sure that our submission will be approved." And, turning to the doctor, he said, "Do you know what kind of man this is?" 11 Nazi airplanes shot down. The last one was a battering ram. I wanted to thank the general, to say that my life belongs to the people, to the party. But weakness again seized me, and I only quietly said the statute, I serve the Soviet Union. The division commander went to the other wounded pilots, and I closed my eyes and could not make out whether it was a dream or reality. Hero of the Soviet Union. Was I worthy of such a high title? I wish I could recover soon and get back into a combat vehicle. After all, how many things are ahead of me, and I have done so little. In the divisional infirmary in Karachev, together with other pilots, I stayed till October 1st. Comrades visited us every day. Frequent guests were the regiment commander Resnik, military commander Shabanov, friends from the squadron. On September 26th, the next bunk was occupied by Shkatov. On that day in the morning he participated in an airfield attack near Seshcha. While performing the task, his plane was shot down. Shkatov reached his airfield, but when landing broke his arm, received several serious bruises. It is ridiculous to rejoice that my friend went to the infirmary. Of course, but frankly speaking, with the appearance of Shkatov, I felt better somehow. With Shkatov, we were friends before the war. At the front, we flew together on combat missions and fought in air battles. We had something to remember, something to talk about. Shkatov said that the situation at the front is heating up. The Germans are pulling up reserves. On the front roads, active movement of tanks, more fascist planes began to appear. From the further story, Shkatov, I learned that the group he was part of, under the command of Major Resnik, went to attack the enemy airfield. But it turned out to be empty. Then our fighters struck a column of vehicles with infantry, heading for the front. Yes, remembered Shkatov, today Sibirin 2 German airplanes destroyed. One, Ju-88, ignited on the ground, and the second, in the air. And with whom he flew the mission? I asked. Roskov was with him, and me, too. All together they stormed. Absolutely. So why don't you talk about yourself? Why should I? I could hardly get him to admit that together with Roskov and Sibirin he burned the Ju-88. Soon Shabanov came in. I complained to him that Shkatov talks about the successes of his comrades, and about himself too sparingly. Shabanov smiled. So, that's not all, said the commissar. Shkatov and other junkers on takeoff shot down. I looked at Shkatov, and he, grinning, turned away. What could I say to him? After all, not only Shkatov is like that. Our guys are ready to talk extensively about the successes of comrades and do not mention themselves. The regiment fought hard in the air, closely cooperating with neighbours, strikes against the enemy. However, these news were only bright spots on a dark background. The situation at the front had aggravated to the limit, and then the rains came more often. The ground was getting soggy. Field airfields were out of order, the actions of aviation hampered. In addition, sharply reduced the number of Ilov. The scales were tipping toward the Germans. It was felt by many signs. Over the airfield, near which was located our infirmary, began to appear often reconnaissance aircraft Henschel 126. It had never happened before that they reached these places. German field artillery was shelling the airfield. On the night of October 2nd, several buses rolled up to the infirmary. "Comrades, we must leave immediately," announced the Dr. Berdylov. The wounded, as they could, began to organise themselves in the buses. Some of them were half lying, some were sitting. I took a seat by the window. Next to me, holding the wounded with his healthy hand, sat Shkatov. It was still quite dark. Most of the wounded had dozed off, despite the shaking. And as soon as the grey morning dawned, everyone leaned against the windows. A sad picture appeared before us. The roads were jammed with people and machinery. Every now and then there were traffic jams. Our buses were standing more than driving. It was good that the weather was not favourable. It was raining mixed with snow, or the fascist aviation would have gone wild. We travelled from Karachev to Belev for a whole day. Finally, when it was already dark, we arrived. We were fed, our wounds were dressed. The medical staff, even in those extremely difficult conditions, tried to do everything to help us. In Belev we did not stay long. The enemy had broken through the front, was already in Oral, and was rapidly advancing to the north. We were loaded into an echelon and sent to the east. There were no special wagons, and the wounded were loaded into ordinary teplushki. In those conditions, it was not easy to provide even such transportation to the wounded. However, the command did everything possible. The train was moving slowly. We stood at every junction, and at the station Gorbachevo stopped for a long time. And then the German aviation struck. However, anti-aircraft machine guns, with which our train was armed, blocked the way of enemy planes with their fire. In a few days we reached Penza. Then the train turned to Ruzevka. In the morning, it was already October 9th or 10, we woke up and saw a big station in the window. "Where are we standing?" we asked a passing orderly. "Ulyanovsk," he said. This word burned me as if by fire. All families of our regiment's personnel were evacuated to Ulyanovsk. My wife and my little girl should be here too. A doctor entered the carriage and announced that some of the wounded, those whose treatment did not require much time, would be left in the hospitals of Ulyanovsk. At the same time, he read the list of those who remained. I was not on the list, but on crutches. I went to the doctor and persistently asked and persuaded him to send me to a local hospital. I spoke confusedly and incoherently because of excitement, but the doctor understood me and agreed. "Good," he said. That same day I looked out of the window of the former school, where the hospital was located, on the street of the ancient Volga city, which gave the world the great Lenin. At the address I knew from my letters, I asked my sister to inform Marina that I was here. The sister of our ward willingly volunteered to carry the note, and in the evening I had visitors. But it was not Marina and her little girl, but the wives of Ovcharov and Voynov. From their first words I learned that, having received a letter from me, in which I rashly gave advice to go to her mother, Marina quickly packed up and left. To the Oral region? I caught my breath. I knew perfectly well that it was there, in the village of Droskovo, she went. But the Germans are there now. Having broken through the defences of the Bryansk front, the fascist troops occupied the territory of the Oral region. Where are Marina and Galochka now? The first 3 days I still had hope that they had not had time to get to the place and returned. But day after day passed, week after week, and there was no news from Marina. A heavy stone was laid on my heart. The war had scattered tens of thousands of military families, especially those who served near the border. I again remembered the highway near Slutsk, killed women and children. Officers' wives often have a hard time in peacetime. Before the war, it was rare for anyone to serve in one place for more than a year. They had to move from garrison to garrison. Once you got settled in, you had to move on. There were a lot of troubles in everyday life, but our faithful battle friends did not complain, did not cry. They shared with us all the inconveniences, all the hardships of military service, and when the war broke out, many of them joined the ranks of the defenders of the motherland, fought in partisan units. It was not easier for those who saved children under the bombings, and then, tirelessly, worked in the rear, in factories, plants and fields, providing the front with everything needed to defeat the enemy. The evacuation of our families was relatively quiet, and now when, it seemed, all the terrible behind, Marina and Galoshka again found themselves in the crucible of the military fire. In October it was already widely known about the atrocities of Hitler's invaders in the occupied territory, about their abuse of the families of Soviet soldiers. In the press there were reports that the invaders were stealing our people to Germany. In one frontline newspaper I came across the following lines: "Forgive me, farewell. What can a slave give a slave, a cast-iron German land? Probably on some aspen tree. A noose is ready for me. Forgive me, my love. Forget those braids. They're dead. They'll never grow again. Forget the calamus, the dew on the calamus. Forget everything, but only revenge." I reread the poem for the second, third time, and it seemed to me all the time that not an unknown poet, But my wife, Marina, was writing these lines and directly addressing me. My heart was burning. I cut out the poem and, together with a small photograph of my wife, kept it under the cover of my party card. At the end of October, I was visited by Shabanov, the commissar of our regiment, who was passing through Ulyanovsk. As soon as he entered the room, I immediately felt bad. The commissar's face had become gaunt and was stamped with great suffering. "What happened, Comrade Commissar?" I asked him, rising on the pillow. "How is your health?" Shabanov interrupted me. I answered briefly and repeated my question. Then Vasily Ivanovich told in detail what happened to our regiment. In the morning of October 2nd, the regiment flew to a airfield in the place Narishkino near Orel. From there, our pilots fought against the broken-through group of Guderian. However, soon German tanks appeared on the border of the airfield. Then the regiment flew to the airfield Mtsensk, north of Orel. But even at this airfield did not have to stay long, because the enemy tanks appeared here too. In addition, communication with the division headquarters was interrupted. Then Reznik and Shabanov, having discussed the situation, made a decision to fly at dusk to the airfield near Tula to prevent the destruction of the regiment by enemy tanks. Those who could not fly to Tula, the commander recommended to land, focusing on the station Gorbachevo, where 10 kilometers to the southwest there was a large flat field. When we flew up to Tula, it was already dark. The command of the air defence of Tula did not know about the arrival of the regiment. At the appearance of our plans, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire from all guns. While the radio settled organisational issues, it became even darker. We had to land on a completely unfamiliar airfield. In addition, the last drops of fuel were left in the tanks. That's when something happened that nobody expected. Aircraft, which was flying Reznik when landing, overturned. The squadron commander Ovcharov was severely wounded. Shabanov left, and I still long lay looking at the ceiling and thought about the fate of comrades. Yes, in the army need the highest organisation and order. The news that brought Shabanov, as well as the alarming reports of the Sovinform Bureau, painfully echoed in my heart. My comrades in the ward grieved with me. But no matter how hard it was for us at times, no matter what black thoughts possessed us, our faith in victory did not waver. Our attention was fixed on Moscow. Every morning, with anxiety and hope, we turned on the radio. But it brought no consolation. And suddenly, in the evening of November 6, 1941, Moscow began to broadcast a solemn meeting dedicated to the 24th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. We listened very attentively to the report. The very fact that the capital city was celebrating the anniversary of October in such an atmosphere encouraged us better than any speeches. After all, it was evidence of confidence in our strength, in the fact that Moscow remains an indestructible stronghold, which will inevitably be crushed by Hitler's war machine. And when the next day there was a parade on Red Square, we finally perked up our spirits. "We will not surrender Moscow." These words were repeated with firm confidence by everyone. I wanted to return to the front as soon as possible, but as a pity, my stay in the hospital was delayed. There were a lot of wounded. The medical staff worked 12, 14 and even 16 hours a day, trying to speed up our recovery. Only on December 2nd, I was discharged from the hospital and was sent to Saratov, to the Volga military district. In those days, trains stood for a long time, not only at stations, but also at small semi-stations. The road from Ulyanovsk to Saratov took several days. On the way, my wounds opened, and I went straight from the train to the hospital, where I was hospitalized for a month. Lying in the hospital is generally a pleasure, as they say, below average, and in those days it was especially bitter. Our troops inflicted the first major defeat of the German fascist army near Moscow. Hitlerites were rolling back from the capital. I wanted to be there, in the ranks of the defenders of the great city, together with them to smash the enemy. The incomparable mood possessed everyone. Literally, they did not leave the loudspeakers, greedily catching every word about the defeat of the enemy near Moscow. These days, the song of the capital's defenders became popular. Its heartfelt words sounded like a victory march. We will not tremble in the battle for our capital. Our native Moscow is dear to us. An unbreakable wall, a steel defence. We'll crush and destroy the enemy. Under the impression of joyful news from the front, I arrived at the headquarters of the district. There I was as if poured a bucket of cold water, announcing that I was appointed an instructor in the Reserve Aviation Regiment. What? To the rear? Hell no. For the first time in my army life, I protested against the order. I'm not going. Only to the front. The personnel officer, apparently accustomed to such things, began to calmly explain that I was given a very important task and that I would still have time to go to the front. But I did not want to listen to anything. To all his arguments, to all his words, I opposed my demand. To the front, and I managed to get my way. I was sent as Deputy Squadron Commander to the 439th Fighter Regiment, which was soon to join the active army. The commander of the 144th Fighter Aviation Division, Colonel Starostepenkov, when I arrived at his place, confirmed that in 10-15 days the regiment would fly to the front. But we were unexpectedly delayed. In the regiment I was met cordially. With the squadron commander, Captain Alexander Maslenikov, we became great friends. He and I talked for hours about his daughters and families. Maslenikov's family lived in his hometown of Gorky. His wife often sent him letters. But no one wrote to me. And Sasha, as soon as he could, consoled me, calmed me, said that everything would be all right. Everything would be all right. He did not say any particularly persuasive words, but how pleasant it is to hear the voice of a friend in a difficult moment. Yes, the folk wisdom is right, saying that the divided grief is half a grief. But besides friendly participation, there is another excellent remedy for heavy thoughts. It's work. My hopes to get to the front as soon as possible were not justified. Our regiment was included in the air defence of Saratov, and we stayed there until April. But we had enough to do. Despite the fact that during this period the German aviation did not make raids on Saratov, we were constantly on combat duty. Our regiment was armed with familiar to me airplanes, MiG-3. Sharing experience with pilots, I told about the battles near Bryansk, about the actions of my comrades in the regiment. I was also learning. I had not yet had to fight at night, and now I was carefully studying and mastering flights in these difficult conditions. And here again we cannot but remember Captain Maslenikov. He already had experience in night air battles. He had a lot of downed German airplanes on his account, and Sasha's advice was very useful to me. Maybe I was just lucky, although I am not inclined to attach much importance to accidents, but all my commanders were competent, skillful and brave pilots. Such was the case with the 439th Fighter Aviation Regiment. The regiment commander at that time was Major Semyonov, the commissar was Battalion Commissar Klushnikov, and the chief of staff was Captain Vetlushsky. It was not easy for them, if only because the personnel of the regiment was gathered, as they say, from a tree. The pilots came from different places, poorly know each other, and the first task, which was solved by the command, was to build a strong combat team, fostering friendship. In any kind of troops, camaraderie and mutual assistance play a paramount role. But in aviation, these qualities are of special importance. That's why so much attention and paid our commanders and educational work. In our regiment, literally day and night, instructor of the political department of the division, Theodor Ilyich Oiserman. This, already at that time, a major scientist-philosopher, had a rather modest rank of political officer, but he was a real fighter of the party, and his authority was measured not by the number of dice on the buttonholes, but by the passion, business, wealth of knowledge. It is a sin to say that sometimes conversations or lectures act like sleeping pills on listeners. But when Oiserman took the floor, there were no indifferent people. Many years have passed since those days, but I still remember Theodore Ilyitch's talks, his words imbued with Bolshevik passion about the inevitability of our victory, which ignite hearts. This is the definition that characterized Oisemann's speeches extremely briefly and at the same time exhaustively. And if for me my mentor at the courses of Link, Commander's Officer Kramov, remains an example forever, then in the political officer of the war years Oisemann I see a model of a political worker, friend and comrade. In the meantime, winter had already begun to wane. It was clear that the Germans would try to take revenge for the defeat at Moscow. So, our stay in the rear ends, and this is a great joy for overstayed pilots. And indeed, in early April, we received an order to relocate the regiment to the area of Stalingrad. At that time, Stalingrad was still a deep rear, but the General Command, as further events showed, not by chance sent combat units to this very area. Here, in the neighbourhood, on the same airfield with us, was a regiment commanded by Major Kapustin. With pilots and technicians of this regiment, we immediately established warm, friendly relations. Neighbours told us that German warplanes did not appear over Stalingrad yet, but scouts were flying. After arriving in Stalingrad, we continued to build up the combat team. Mainly practiced aerobatics in the zone, air battles and shooting at air and ground targets. On UT-4 airplanes we made flights in clouds and at night, and then these tasks were performed on MiG-3 combat airplanes. With the help of neighbours studied the combat area, determined the most likely routes of enemy aerial scouts. In May, fascist scouts, although rarely, but began to appear in the area of Stalingrad Industrial District. It was not so easy to shoot down an enemy reconnaissance airplane. The difficulty lay in the fact that the control of fighters in the air was not yet properly practiced. The year of war brought great changes in the organisation and provision of air defence equipment. The air defence troops were much better equipped with both combat equipment and means of support. But there was still a lot of unclear, especially in the issues of control, guidance of fighters on the air enemy, and in the organisation of interaction. Difficulties in intercepting scouts were aggravated by the fact that reconnaissance flights were conducted at high altitudes at that time, 7,000 to 8,000 metres. As a result, it turned out that no matter how hard we tried to destroy the enemy, he most often left unharmed. More than once and not twice the division command gathered pilots of both regiments based nearby. We analysed our blunders, carefully studied the routes and flight profile of enemy aerial reconnaissance flights. The Germans flew reconnaissance flights to the Stalingrad area from Mariupol and Poltava, but as a rule they came to the target from the southwest. From Stalingrad they left by different ways. Then their route passed through Elista, Vladimirovka, then through Tsimlyanskaya. The main target of their observation, as we have seen, were the railroad lines and the Volga River, especially the direction Stalingrad, Borisoglebsk, Stalingrad, Kalach, Morozovskaya, Likaya, Kotelnikovo, Rostov, and, of course, Stalingrad. Still, we managed to find certain regularities in the actions of fascist pilots. Whatever ways they went to Stalingrad, but in the area of the city came out on certain routes. In addition, they appeared at approximately the same time. Having studied all the accumulated data, the command made a decision. At the appearance of German planes to raise in the air pairs and links, which were then on duty in the air in the areas of probable routes of scouts at an altitude of up to 8,000 metres. Fighting with scouts is a special kind of air combat, requiring above all great endurance and perseverance, the ability to navigate well in the air when searching for the enemy. You can fly several times to a given area and return with nothing. The enemy will not be found. But you cannot lose patience. When a sniper is hunting for an enemy gunner, he sometimes lies still for days. So for us, fighter pilots, in the hunt for scouts, endurance played a paramount role. Search, search, and search became our motto, and our labour was not wasted. It's a clear, sunny day. Visibility, as pilots say, is 1,000,000 to 1,000,000. In the barrage zone, Sergeant Lyamin. Short, clear commands from the control room, and the pilots turn their planes on a given course. After a while, they notice the enemy scout. The single combat began. Lyamin, having used up his ammunition, destroyed the scout in the sky of Stalingrad with a ramming blow. The next time Viktor Smirnov, an experienced Far Eastern pilot, drove another Nazi pirate into the ground with an aptly timed burst. After some pause, the scouts appeared again. On May 24, 1942, it was clear and sunny. Early in the morning, when we arrived at the airfield, everyone was breathing in the clean air with pleasure. About 5 o'clock in the morning, Maslenikov and I flew out on a barrage, quickly gained altitude. When the altimeter arrow showed 800 meters, we started duty in the specified area. We were in the same mood as the weather, just as good. But time passed, and the enemy scout did not appear. We had to land with unspent combat kit. After staying at high altitude, felt fatigue. The mechanic of the plane, Sergeant Frolkin, was preparing the plane for a second flight. I lay down under the plane, putting a parachute under my head as a pillow. A fresh breeze was blowing pleasantly on my face, which was hot after the flight. At that time I received a letter from my older brother, who had fought near Staraya Russa. I remembered my wife and daughter. Heavy thoughts clouded my mind with all the colours of the May day. Suddenly there were loud claps of anti-aircraft shells bursting. I quickly jumped to my feet, put on a parachute, and took a seat in the cockpit of the airplane. I look up and see how at a high altitude, leaving behind him a plume of inversion, to the northwest is flying enemy aircraft. 3 pairs of fighters of the neighbouring regiment and a pair of our MiG-3s took off to intercept the enemy on the command of the division commander, hero of the Soviet Union, Colonel III Krasnoyarchenko, who was in Beketovka. Everything in me is tense. In my mind I am already there, in the sky, fighting with the enemy. "Permission to take off," I ask on the radio. There was a crackle in the headphones of the helmet phone, and only the end of the word reached me. "Shayu?" I didn't try to figure out what it meant. No permission, or, on the contrary, permission. Remove the pads. Sergeant Frolkin can't hear anything because of the engine noise, but he understands me without words. And right from the parking lot I take off. At maximum mode with a gain of altitude, I'm heading west towards the town of Kalacha and the station of Lozhki. I was firmly convinced that the enemy plane will go there, and my task is to reach this area earlier. MiG as if transmitted my excitement and breathing. The plane trembles finely and goes at maximum speed with a set, and now it's already at the target point. Height, 8,500 meters. Now we have to wait. There are languid minutes of waiting and searching. Attention is sharpened. There's no one to rely on but myself. If I spot the enemy in time, success is assured. And if the Germans spot my plane before I do, I'll have to return with nothing. But no, the enemy didn't slip through. In 3 to 4 minutes, I see a dot in the east. It's either the enemy or our plane. I wish there was a scout. Either way, we have to be ready. After all, it's been 8 months since I took part in the air battle near Bryansk. I look keenly into the airspace, take the initial position for the attack. The point is approaching, increasing in size. Now there is no doubt, it's him. Junkers 88. The enemy is detected in the area of Kalach, Spoons. I report by radio to the command post of the regiment, where was Colonel Krasnoyarchenko. Attack. And now my MiG confidently goes towards the fascist vulture. The attack was swift. I managed to destroy the top gunner with the first burst. It seemed that the victory was close, and it should happen. My airplane jammed the belt of shells. Junkers, taking advantage of this, goes to the northwest, where about 25 kilometers from us floated clouds. The decision matured instantly. Ram. Seeing that the gunner is killed, I go forward, cross the course of Junkers, forcing him to turn left at 90 dig and go south, where the sky is shinning blue and where there are no clouds in which he could hide. On Reconnaissance, as you know, flew experienced pilots. Such was my enemy. Skillfully manoeuvring, he got out from under the blow. The ram failed. U-88 began to dive sharply and at minimum altitude switched to shaving flight. The enemy's calculation was clear. He thought that at low altitude he would be able to merge with the ground and I would lose sight of him. Well, the enemy calculated correctly. But he did not take into account one thing: the character of the Soviet people, their readiness to fight to the last man. And where could he, the nurturer of fascism, understand the soul of the Soviet man? I followed the Junkers relentlessly on a glancing flight and maximum speed. If only the weapon hadn't failed. 1, 2 lines, and that's all. True, and the enemy does not shoot, because the gunner is killed. Junkers makes sharp turns to the right, then to the left, not allowing to come close, and yet I managed. At the moment of turning Junkers to the left, climbed under it from below, balanced the speed and hit the propeller on the tail feathering. I lost consciousness. The ram occurred at a height of about 30 meters, and the fall would have been fatal. But because I was hitting the enemy from the bottom up, my airplane went with a gain of altitude at first. I managed to regain consciousness and even released the landing gear. Of course, it was not a landing, but a fall, but the native land near the station Milutinskaya gently took his son. I survived. True, my left leg was injured again, and I had enough bruises. I sat near the airplane on the ground and, rolling a bitter blade of grass in my mouth, looked at the sky. Silence and heat, as if there were no war. But the thought flashed and immediately disappeared. The rumble of distant explosions, the desolation of a wide field brought me back to reality. An hour and a half later, right on the field, not far from my MiG, landed a Red Star airplane, UT-2. Before I could get to my feet, I saw the division commander, Colonel Krasnoyurchenko, getting out of the plane. He ran towards me and, without saying a word, hugged me tightly and kissed me. Immediately relieved from the heart. After all, I consoled myself with the thought that I did not hear the response of the division commander to the request to authorize the flight. I was experienced enough to realize that he replied, "I do not allow it." But now, apparently, and Krasnoyurchenko agrees that I simply did not understand him. The division commander asked about the battle in detail. While I was telling, another airplane landed nearby. The colonel ordered me to take the passenger seat, and we went home. I had to spend a few days in the hospital again to heal the bruises received during the ramming. The medical staff, as always, surrounded us with the warmest care, and this warmth, better than anything else, helped to restore health and strength. After the hospital, I was granted a leave of absence. The command gave me a big surprise. I was sent to Moscow to receive the Order of the Red Star, which I was awarded back in September 1941. And here I was, walking through the streets of the capital with excitement. For the first time I was in Moscow in 1938, when I was on my way to an aviation school. Then I remembered it as noisy and cheerful. But now the faces of Muscovites have grown gloomy. True, the Nazis had been driven away from the city, but the front was relatively close. In the squares protruded the barrels of anti-aircraft guns. In the streets passed soldiers with aerial barrage balloons. Dense covers covered the Kremlin stars. The walls of the Kremlin, Red Square camouflaged. Everywhere felt the breath of war. When I arrived at the Kremlin, there was a calm, business-like atmosphere. All the awardees were invited to the Sverdlovsk Hall. "Sit down, comrades," they offered us. We sat down. Silence reigned in the hall for several minutes. Excitement engulfed everyone. "We are in the Kremlin. We will be presented with awards." At the appointed time, exactly, minute by minute, Mikhail Ivanovich Kalinin and Secretary of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR Gorkin entered the hall. Having greeted us warmly, Mikhail Ivanovich stood near the table where the awards were lying. Gorkin began to read the decrees on awarding. One by one, the frontline soldiers approached the all-Union headman. Each comrade was greeted with friendly, warm applause. Joyful excitement possessed all of us. and then I heard my surname. As if in a fog, I walked to the table. Mikhail Ivanovich smiled welcomingly, encouragingly. He shook my hand firmly. In a fatherly way, he handed me the order and said, "Thank you, Comrade Kozlov. Thank you to the party, to the people. Thank you for the award, for bringing me up, giving me a powerful weapon, teaching me to fight the enemy," I wanted to say, but only briefly replied, "I serve the Soviet Union." And when the awarding was over, Mikhail Ivanovich willingly took pictures with us. And all the time he was chatting amiably with the front-line soldiers, joking. M.I. Kalinin kept with us so simply, at ease, that we felt as if we were visiting a good father. Encouraged, I returned to Stalingrad. At the division headquarters, I reported to Colonel I. Krasnoyarchenko, that I had arrived from leave. "Excellent," he said. "Take the squadron in Kapustin's regiment." I relocated to the other side of the airfield. Usually in a new place, everyone at first feels quite constrained. You don't know anyone and they don't know you. You get to know your new co-workers, and they get to know you. This process is not very calm and not always painless, but it didn't take me long to get used to the new place. Since we stood on the same airfield, the pilots of both regiments knew each other well, and I immediately found myself in my environment. The personnel of this regiment already had glorious traditions. Major Kapustin fought for Odessa. His deputy, Major Kamenshchikov, was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for his exploits in the battles near Moscow. Squadron Commander Captain Smirnov, in January, March 1942, shot down 2 enemy scouts. In the squadron entrusted to me, many pilots have also already been shelled. Squadron Commissar, Senior Lieutenant Bashkirov, Senior Lieutenant Chumakov, Lieutenant Vasin, Junior Lieutenants Liamin and Gultyaev had on their combat account shot down enemy planes. But there were in the squadron and young fighters who had not yet really smelled the gunpowder. They had to be put into service as soon as possible. However, for this I myself had to do a lot. I had flown MiGs before, and this regiment was armed with fighters of Yakovlev's design, Yak-1 and Yak-7. According to tactical and technical data, these airplanes were much superior to the MiGs. Yakovlev fighters were distinguished by higher horizontal and vertical speed, had better data in vertical and horizontal maneuver, were less severe on takeoff and landing. An important advantage of the Yak was armament. It had a cannon. In those days, the enemy quite rarely bothered us, and we used the time to improve our flight training. Special attention was paid to practicing the forms and methods of fighting against bombers covered by fighters, as well as against single fighters. In addition, we're preparing to strike at ground troops. We had enough material to study the enemy. We analysed the conducted air battles, all the best took into account. It was necessary as soon as possible to put young people into service. Sergeants Loparev, Trofimov, Turin, and some other pilots came to the regiment directly from the schools, where they took a crash course. They still had to work hard to become true defenders of their native skies. The main work with young pilots were squadron commanders. They practiced with them navigational training, piloting techniques in the zone, especially complex and aerobatics. Combat experience has clearly shown how great is the importance of navigational training of the pilot. Without mastering it thoroughly, the airfighter will not be able to confidently conduct combat and in general to fulfill more or less complex tasks. Only after mastering all the subtleties of navigational business, the pilot as if fused with the aircraft. And if in battle for any reason he will break away from the group, will be alone, then, owning navigational skills, he can easily restore orientation, determine his location, and manage to go where needed. It is not superfluous to note that at that time radio equipment for airplane navigation on board the machines were not. In the hands of a skillful fighter aircraft, Yak-1 was a very formidable machine, and we strived to ensure that each pilot could squeeze from it all that he is able to give. Special attention was paid to fire training. Its importance was once again confirmed by the case of a young pilot, Yuri Lyamin. For the first time meeting in the air U-88, he boldly and decisively went into the attack. On the side of Yuri was the suddenness, and with accurate fire he would quickly finish off the enemy. However, the young pilot opened fire from too great a distance. Attack follows attack, but the fire of his machine guns is ineffective, and then the ammunition ran out. You have to give Yuri credit. In a difficult situation, he showed great will to victory, courage and heroism. Lyamin destroyed the enemy bomber with a ram and landed safely. They say that the winners are not judged, but Yuri himself made the necessary conclusion from this case. It was a very brave and capable pilot. On September 6, 1942, in an unequal air battle over Stalingrad, Yuri died a hero's death. The sun hung over the steppe, scorching with such force that it seems that its rays pressed to the ground. The grass at the airfield has turned yellow, leaves on the trees, as if trying to hide from the sun's rays, curled up in tubes. It's hot, a little bit of coolness from the Volga, and again heat, heat, heat. These days the enemy launched an attack on Stalingrad. Flying over the steppe, we saw boxes of fascist tanks crawling below, columns of troops moving. Hitler's command threw on the city huge forces, not only ground but also air. The battle on the Volga River unfolded in a difficult for our homeland military and political situation. Obligations to open a second front in Europe the Allies did not fulfill. Our army was forced to fight alone with the main forces of the armies of the fascist bloc. Only from March to mid-November 1942, 80 divisions were transferred to the Soviet-German front. Having superiority in people and armament, the German fascist command aimed to finally defeat the main forces of the Red Army and end the war against the Soviet Union in 1942. At the beginning of the operation, the German command planned to capture Stalingrad with relatively limited forces of the Sixth Army. But the measures of the Soviet command to strengthen the troops defending here and their stubborn resistance slowed down the enemy's offensive. Hitler's generals in July, August were forced to throw from the North Caucasus direction to strengthen the Sixth Army, the Fourth Panzer Army, the Eighth Italian Army and several separate divisions of Germans and Romanians. In the Stalingrad direction, the total number of enemy formations was brought to 50. Continuously came large marching replenishments and special units. From the air, this grouping was supported by the main forces of the 4th Air Fleet, reinforced by the 8th Air Corps. The enemy here had more than 1,470 aircraft, including 800 bombers and 500 fighters. Hitlerites threw under Stalingrad their best squadrons, Göring's Group, fighters of Berlin Air Defense, 52nd Fighter Squadron of Aces, which were armed with the newest brands of fighters Me-109F and Me-109G. All this created air superiority for the enemy at the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad. Taking into account the importance of the Stalingrad direction, in the second half of July 1942, the Supreme High Command carried out a number of important measures. The Stalingrad Corps air defense area was strengthened, which covered the most important objects of the city and the rear of the front. In addition, 5 regiments of the 102nd Fighter Aviation Division were transferred to the operational subordination of the Corps Air Defense District. From all parts of the Corps air defense area, Stalingrad was covered from the air at different times, from 80 to 90% of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aviation. Colonel E. A. Rainin was appointed commander of the troops of the Corps Air Defense Area. Colonel Beserebrennikov was appointed Chief of Staff. Colonel Krasnoyarchenko commanded the 102nd Fighter Aviation Division, and then Colonel Puntus. The flying staff of the division in fierce air battles had to learn to beat the enemy, to improve flying skills, to develop their own more advanced methods of air combat. The command and staffs of the division and regiments made the best practices the property of each pilot. Staffs learned the art of managing units on the ground and in the air. The flying staff sought first of all to destroy the enemy bombers, skillfully using echeloned-in-height combat order, frontal attacks and rocket fire. Good discretion and mutual aid became the laws of air combat. Skillful use of manoeuvring advantages of aircraft I-16 and I-153 in conjunction with the fire of RS made these obsolete aircraft a formidable weapon in the fight against the arrogant German aces. Such form of air combat as ramming became mass and was used successfully. During 1942, the pilots of the division shot down 18 Nazi planes without a single loss in their fighters by the method of ramming. To cover the objects of Stalingrad, and troops on the battlefield began to send strong patrols of 8 to 12 aircraft, and on the ground in readiness, No. 1 was constantly in the reserve, which was raised in the air battle with superior enemy forces, and also used to cover the landing of fighters returning from a combat mission. The results of hard combat training did not slow down. Already in August 1942, the pilots of the 102nd Fighter Air Division conducted 181 air battles and shot down 146 German planes. These air battles showed that the flying staff has acquired sufficient combat training. Against the enemy spy planes were specially selected pairs, developed a special tactics of battle. It was decided to take to the air simultaneously pairs of Yakov and MiG. Pilots Yakov occupied the height of 5,000 to 6,000 meters, and MiG climbed to 7,000 to 8,000 meters. Such tactics fully justified themselves. Flying out early in the morning, our fighters consisting of pairs of Maslenikov on MiGs and Smirnov on Yaks found 2 messers. German pilots, having seen 2 of our fighters, entered the battle. Maslenikov and his wingman rushed from above and lit one enemy airplane on fire with an aptly timed shot. The second hastened to get away. Taking advantage of his momentary confusion, Smirnov pierced the messer with a cue, and it burst into flames. However, this battle was probably the only one in which the enemy had no superiority. As soon as the Nazi troops launched an offensive and the main forces of the enemy's air fleet began to operate, we constantly had to fight at an unfavourable balance of forces. The enemy was not able to suppress us morally. The nerves of the Soviet pilots who defended their native land were strong. On July 23, 1942, a pilot of the 629th Fighter Aviation Regiment, Senior Sergeant Popov, on an I-16 aircraft, detected an enemy Dornier 215 aircraft at an altitude of 1,500 meters heading for Stalingrad near Osinovka. Approaching the enemy, Popov made several attacks from behind, from above and below from a distance of 200 to 100 meters, and took out both enemy gunners. But the ammunition ran out, and the Nazi plane continued to fly. Then the Soviet pilot decided to ram the enemy. The German Vulture, dodging the attacks of the fighter, maneuvered down to shaving flight. But Popov still chose a convenient moment, and having equalized speed, the propeller of his fighter hit the right side of the tail feathering Dornier. The fighter's propeller stopped, and Staff Sergeant Popov, having skipped under the wires, sat down in the field without releasing the landing gear. And the enemy plane went into dive, crashed into the ground and burned. On July 17 and 27, 1942, pilots of the division Nadeyev and Loginov destroyed enemy planes by ramming. The pilots of our squadron also passed the severe examination. The hot steppe sun was slowly slipping to the west. At the airfield, in readiness for the flight, was 4. I with wingman Pascual José and Chumakov with Banelia Santa Maria. My wingman in a friendly circle respectfully called Serov. The young Spaniard volunteered to fight against the fascists of Spain. Pascual José, like Banelia Santa Maria, came to our country after the defeat of the Republicans. In their hearts burned a sacred hatred for the Nazis, who helped the executioner Franco to establish a bloody regime in Spain. And as soon as the war broke out, Pascual José, along with many of his friends, voluntarily joined the Red Army. Soviet pilot Serov fought the fascists on my land, and I will beat them on yours. He answered the question that prompted him to join the ranks of the defenders of our homeland. Hero of the Soviet Union. Anatoly Serov was Pasquale's favourite friend. I flew today as Serov flew in Spain, he told us when he was satisfied with the flight. But despite the hotness and love of lush expressions, such an assessment he gave himself infrequently. Pasquale was characterized by modesty, and in battle skillfully restrained his passions. Such a wingman, the leader was always satisfied. You could rely on the pair Chumakov, Bernalia. In battle they have repeatedly proved their skill, fearlessness, determination. The command to take off sounded, and our four rushed into the sky. Still gaining altitude, we saw ahead, over Stalingrad, a group of 6 Messerschmitts, which had just come out of the battle with a couple of our I-16. And how sorry were our pilots, who, despite their courage, could not resist the numerical superiority of the enemy. One I-16, engulfed in fire, went to the ground. There was no reason to engage in battle against 6 Messers without providing favourable conditions for the fight. Do not engage in battle, gaining altitude, transmitted on the radio. Turning in our direction, began to gain altitude and enemy pilots. Front, one against the other, went up our Yaks and fascist Messers. The distance between them was not great. All this happened over Stalingrad. When the sun was already setting, it was a clear, cloudless evening. We had no advantage in height and speed, and we did not think that the moment for the attack had come. The commander of the enemy fighter group preferred to wait, although the Germans had an advantage in numbers, so we went higher and higher. And when the altimeter arrow showed more than 6,000 metres, we, as on command, simultaneously turned on the afterburner and instantly were above the enemy by 50-100 metres, and then followed a vigorous turn in his direction. Now the conditions for an attack were created, but the Germans did not take the fight. Messers instantly, all of a sudden, performed a U-turn and, deep diving, went to the west. Chasing them was pointless, and although not a single bullet, not a single shell was not fired in this encounter, we won a great and important psychological victory. And this was also worth a lot. After all, in these days there was combat reconnaissance of the airspace above Stalingrad. The enemy was desperately rushing to the city, continuously introducing fresh forces into the battle. Fierce air battles broke out now and then in the sky. At the end of July, the enemy aviation for the first time attempted a night raid on Stalingrad. But Hitlerites did not succeed. Anti-aircraft artillery, providing in the near approaches a circular cover of city objects, met fascist pirates with dense fire. Only single airplanes broke through to the city, and they failed to strike at military-industrial facilities. The situation at the front sharply aggravated. Hitlerites managed to occupy Donbass. Fascist troops were rushing to Rostov. Fierce battles were fought on the ground and in the air. In airfights, my old friend Mikhail Baranov covered himself with unfading glory. In one battle on August 5, he shot down 4 German planes. For the first time I had to meet Baranov when entering the Leningrad Aero Club, where I had been studying for several weeks. Looking patronizingly at the short, stubby boy, I brought him to the head of the Aero Club. Misha loudly reported, "Comrade Chief, I want to enter the flying club." The chief critically examined him and asked, "How old are you?" 16. Without blinking an eye, Misha blurted out, "It doesn't look like it. Show me your passport." "I left it at home, but honestly, I'm already 16. Accept me." That's how we got Mikhail Baranov at the flying club. He grew up in the village of Gorka in the Leningrad region, but in order to enter the flying club, he moved to the city and entered the factory school. The head of the flying club, of course, guessed that the boy is not 16, but was subdued by his persistence. Misha was accepted. By the way, he was not the only hare. Kamelkov, who studied with us in the Aero Club, also said, "We'll soon be 16. Fate brought us together for a long time." After the flying club, Baranov, Kamelkov and I studied together in Tuguev Aviation School. Moreover, in the same unit. Our first tutor was an instructor, Lieutenant Grigory Hort. He was only 5-6 years older than us, but we looked at him as new recruits at a battle-hardened veteran. Hort said was law to us. It was no accident that our tutor was highly respected. He perfectly piloted the airplane, knew his business, skillfully passed his knowledge to us, was demanding and at the same time a very warm-hearted person. He was a senior brother to us, and it was a happiness to have such a commander. As it usually happens, some cadets did better, others did worse. Baranov was among them. Outwardly, Mikhail always looked completely calm, but I knew how deeply he experiences his failures, and it is very possible that Baranov would not have become a military pilot, if not for Lieutenant Hort. The instructor never jumped to conclusions. He believed in people and instilled this faith in them. Mikhail studied hard, diligently, but not everything he did. And Hort and Link Commander Mayakov did not reproach him, but only tried to help. Thunder clouds of war, gathering in Western Europe, urgently required accelerated training of pilots. The Air Force leadership decided to organize from those cadets who successfully mastered flight training, a group of accelerated training. At the same time, it was decided to expel unpromising cadets from the school. We were anxiously awaiting the responsible examination, which was to be conducted by the deputy head of the school for flight training, Shatilov. He had the decisive word in determining our future fate. There were plenty of reasons for excitement. After all, decided the fate of a man, to be or not to be a pilot. And when you are in love with your chosen profession, give all your efforts to master it, believe in yourself, but you are still told that you are unpromising. It is not easy to survive. But if you understand and delve deeply into the true state of affairs, to study the strengths and weaknesses of a person, to give him a spark of hope for success, he will go through all the difficulties. And so Baranov went up in the air with Shatilov. Mikhail then told me that before the flight he was terribly worried. When the command to board the plane was already given, Lieutenant Hort, helping Baranov to put on the parachute, said, "Break a leg, I'm sure that everything will be fine." And this admonition removed the anxiety like a hand. In the air, Mikhail did not think about the fact that behind his back sat a strict examiner and calmly and confidently performed the flight task. We, holding our breath, impatiently waited for the return of our friend. We watched his takeoff on the training airplane UT-4, entrance to the aerobatic zone, aerobatics. Here, Misha confidently performs turns, loops, barrel rolls, combat turns, flips, corkscrew, entry into the airfield circle and landing. The airplane is taxiing, the engine is turned off. Misha is all sweaty, his face is red, excited. After Shatilov, he climbs out of the plane, reports, "Comrade Major, Cadet Baranov completed the task. He's satisfied with the flight. From this guy will be a pilot," concluded after the flight Major Shatilov. The experienced educator of airfighters was not mistaken. During the Great Patriotic War, Mikhail Baranov proved himself a remarkable master of maneuver and fire. He opened his combat account on September 26, 1941, having shot down a Messerschmitt. On October 2nd, Baranov destroyed a Henschel 126 and then, returning to his airfield, shot down another Messer. In the newspaper Red Star, on August 18, 1942, it was reported that for a year of war, Mikhail Baranov conducted 70 air battles, shot down 16 enemy planes himself and 8 in a group. The Battle of August 5, 1942, when two groups of our fighters under the command of Captain Mazurenko and Senior Lieutenant Baranov inflicted huge damage to the enemy, can rightfully be considered one of the finest feats of Soviet pilots. In this battle, Baranov destroyed 3 German airplanes, one by ramming. One of Mikhail Baranov's fights was captured by our cinematographers. This is the only air battle filmed on film during the past war. Unique shots of documentary newsreels brought to our days a harsh frontline reality. Air battles showed that despite the persistence with which the enemy was rushing forward, he can be stopped. It is only necessary to persistently learn the science of winning. The regiment command conducted a lot of work with the flying staff. All pilots learned from the experience of past air battles. We were looking for and found new forms and methods of combat operations. In the last days of July, the commander of the fighter aviation of the air defense of the country, hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant General of Aviation Osipenko, flew to us. His appearance near Stalingrad was explained by the fact that after the German breakthrough in the Rostov area, the command was seriously concerned about the state of affairs in the aviation units. It was necessary to fundamentally change the tactics of combat orders of fighters, to improve the interaction between fighter aviation in the air and ground air defense. Under the leadership of General Osipenko, we solved all these issues. In the skies above the airfield regularly held training air battles. They involved the best pilots of the regiments, Kamenshchikov, Bashkirov, Chumakov, Gultiaev, Smirnov, Vasin, Maslennikov, Gasporian, and others. In the course of these battles practiced new battle orders, which became more stretched and echeloned in height. Hard daily work allowed us to meet the praised fascist aces in the skies of Stalingrad. Tension was growing every day. On August 3rd, patrolling in the air near the station Tundutovo, Misha Chumakov and I detected a German plane, Do-217, which tried to drop bombs on the railway station. With the first attack, the enemy pirate was shot down, but the enemy persistently advanced. The fascist command threw more and more new units into the Stalingrad sky, and we had to fight with numerically superior enemy forces. One of such battles, conducted by pilots of our regiment on August 5th, was reported in the report of Sovinform Bureau. In the sky of Stalingrad, we did not count the enemies. We were looking for a meeting with them, and at any balance of forces went into battle. The party and the motherland gave us, the defenders of the Volga stronghold, the order, not a step back. In the leading article, addressing to the air fighters of the Stalingrad front, the newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda urged to mercilessly crush the enemy, to stand an indestructible wall in the way of the fascist pirates who were tearing towards the city. "Fighter pilots, defenders of Stalingrad," wrote the newspaper. "The country entrusted you with the defense of the city from German Aviation. Your duty and obligation to beat it, not sparing your strength and blood. Remember that the fate of Stalingrad largely depends on your activity, courage and skill, on your help to ground troops. The enemy must be stopped." These words were imprinted in our hearts and became our motto. On August 4th, a dozen of our fighters met a group of fascist planes near Abganerovo station, numbering up to 50 machines. Having accepted the combat order, we resolutely went into the attack. It was a hard fight. 5-fold advantage of the enemy. No joke. But the battle ended with a complete victory of the Soviet pilots. What ensured success? First of all, clear, skillful organization of the battle. Our commander, Major Udovenko, led us in the attack, calculating not on random luck, but on the correct distribution of forces. We flew from the side of the sun and, as if dissolved in its rays, were invisible to Nazi pilots. Major Udovenko took this into account, and the factor of surprise was the basis of the first attack. Fascist air pirates went to Stalingrad in 3 groups. About 3 dozen heavily loaded with bombs. Junkers floated in the sky. A few above the bombers, at an altitude of about 2,500 meters, flew 20 fighters, Messerschmitt 109, which made up the cover group. Quickly assessing the situation, Udovenko made a decision and on the air sounded his command. Chumakov and Wingman, cover group. Echelon, 3,500 meters. Vasin and Wingman, another 500 meters higher, in reserve. The rest, the strike group. When we heard this command, the heart of each of us beat more often. Now we will go into battle. But the commander felt it necessary to give a few more instructions. Strike first of all on the bombers, maximum use of vertical maneuver. And after a short pause, a new order. Attack. From a height of 3,000 meters, the group rushed at the fascist vultures. Hitlerites did not even have time to realize what happened, as several Junkers, smoke, collapsed to the ground. and our yaks rushed upwards and again went to the enemy. The main blow was struck at the first head group of German bombers. The enemy's combat order was upset. We were not slow to take advantage of it. There were so many targets that only have time to attack and escape from under the enemy's attacks. But in battle, it is very important to bring the attack to the end. If you caught an airplane in the sight, hit it until you destroy it, but also watch what is done in the air. If the fascists came from behind, comrades rushed to help. Chumakov and Vassin did not waste time. In this battle, Vassin personally destroyed 2 Hitler planes. I was also lucky. It was pleasant to read laconic lines in the morning report of the Sovinform Bureau for August 19th. The commander of a unit of fighter pilots, Senior Lieutenant Kozlov, shot down 2 German bombers in aerial combat. Comrade Kozlov shot down a total of 13 German airplanes and, together with other pilots, 5 airplanes. But it was later, and in the battle there was no time even to fully feel the joy of victory. The pilots of Junkers, notwithstanding our attacks, began to drop bombs indiscriminately right into the steppe and turn back. But then Messerschmitts got involved. They tried to engage and thus open the way to the defended object to other groups of Junkers. However, nothing came out of this idea. As soon as the enemy fighters rushed at us, Udovenko gave the command. Do not engage in battle with the Messers. Continue to attack the Junkers. And we, evading the attack of fighters, stubbornly went to the bombers. A person watching the air battle from the ground, it can easily seem that in the sky reigns complete chaos. In fact, all the actions of pilots are subordinate to the strictest logic. Conducting air combat, we understood and even anticipated the maneuver of comrades, acted in concert, clearly. Attacks were built in such a way that the enemy was under fire all the time. We destroyed 9 German airplanes in this battle, which lasted 40 minutes. This victory cost us 2 cars. Major Udovenko had to land his yak in the steppe, and Loparev had to leave the plane in the air. And the fact that none of our pilots were killed made the success even more joyful and triumphant. Coherence, interaction, mutual support. In this battle, we appreciated these factors to the full, and how frustrating it was when a few days later a group of our comrades neglected them and suffered heavy losses. True, there were objective reasons for that. Every day the situation was heating up more and more. There were continuous air battles, many pilots were out of action. They were replaced by yesterday's cadets of flight schools, still inexperienced. So it turned out that commanders were forced to send hastily assembled groups, non-flying pairs, to meet the enemy. So it was at the beginning of the second decade of August. The Vernos service reported the approach of a large group of Nazi planes. 6 machines remained at the airfield. The rest were carrying out combat missions. Captain Smirnov, ordered the regiment commander, lead a group of 6 pilots, the task, to repel the raid on Stalingrad. Yes, Viktor Smirnov replied. But of the 5 air fighters entrusted to him, only one Lieutenant Vassin was already an experienced pilot who had shot down planes. Captain Smirnov did not even have the opportunity to talk to the aviators. It was necessary to immediately take to the air. One after another, 6 yak soared into the sky. Soon it became known at the command post that Smirnov discovered the enemy. "Attack," he reported. We never heard his voice again. At the airfield, out of 6 airplanes returned only 3. We looked in vain into the blue distance, whether the rest will not appear. But Smirnov, Vassin, and another young pilot died in this battle. We also suffered great losses in equipment. Our industry supplied the front with excellent airplanes. Yaks excelled in combat, but there were still not enough of them. During this period, on the Stalingrad front began to appear fighters, Hurricane, provided to us by the Allies. These machines were produced since 1938 and could not compete with Messerschmitts. Therefore, when we flew together with pilots on Hurricanes, we had to think most of all about how to protect our comrades flying on British planes from enemy attacks. German aviation from near Kharkov relocated to the areas of Tormosin, Kotelnikovo, Surovikino, Morozovskaya. Approaching Stalingrad, fascist pilots made several raids on the city per day. On August 19th, a shock group of German troops forced the Don and seized the crossings. In the area of Vertyaki, Peskovatka, an enemy bridgehead was formed. Having concentrated there significant forces of tanks and motorized infantry, the enemy with the support of aviation struck in the direction of Azovka, and by the end of August 23rd came to the Volga. The 4th Tank Army of the enemy broke through to the area of Tundutovo. We destroyed 9 German planes in this battle, which lasted 40 minutes. This victory cost us 2 cars. Major Udovenko had to land his Yak in the steppe, and Loparev had to leave the plane in the air, and the fact that none of our pilots were killed made the success even more joyful and triumphant. Coherence, interaction, mutual support. In this battle we appreciated these factors to the full, and how frustrating it was when a few days later a group of our comrades neglected them and suffered heavy losses. True, there were objective reasons for that. Every day the situation was heating up more and more. There were continuous air battles. Many pilots were out of action. They were replaced by yesterday's cadets of flight schools, still inexperienced. So it turned out that commanders were forced to send hastily assembled groups, non-flying pairs, to meet the enemy. So it was at the beginning of the 2nd decade of August. The VNOS service reported the approach of a large group of Nazi planes. 6 machines remained at the airfield. The rest were carrying out combat missions. "Captain Smirnov," ordered the regiment commander, "lead a group of 6 pilots. The task, to repel the raid on Stalingrad." "Yes," Viktor Smirnov replied. But of the 5 air fighters entrusted to him, only one Lieutenant Vassin was already an experienced pilot who had shot down planes. Captain Smirnov did not even have the opportunity to talk to the aviators. It was necessary to immediately take to the air. One after another 6 Yak soared into the sky. Soon it became known at the command post that Smirnov discovered the enemy. "Attack!" he reported. We never heard his voice again. At the airfield, out of 6 airplanes returned only 3. We looked in vain into the blue distance, whether the rest will not appear. But Smirnov, Varsin, and another young pilot died in this battle. We also suffered great losses in equipment. Our industry supplied the front with excellent airplanes. Yaks excelled in combat, but there were still not enough of them. During this period on the Stalingrad front began to appear fighters, Hurricane, provided to us by the Allies. These machines were produced since 1938 and could not compete with Messerschmitts. Therefore, when we flew together with pilots on Hurricanes, we had to think most of all about how to protect our comrades flying on British planes from enemy attacks. German aviation from near Kharkov relocated to the areas of Tormosin, Kotelnikovo, Surovikino, Morozovskaya. Approaching Stalingrad, fascist pilots made several raids on the city per day. On August 19th, a shock group of German troops forced the Don and seized the crossings. In the area of Vertyaki, Peskovatka, an enemy bridgehead was formed. Having concentrated there significant forces of tanks and motorized infantry, the enemy with the support of aviation struck in the direction of Azovka, and by the end of August 23 came to the Volga. The 4th Tank Army of the enemy broke through to the area of Tundutovo. But the enemy failed to break the will of Soviet soldiers, to shake their confidence in victory. The Stalingrad sky became the birthplace of many heroes of the Soviet Union. In these days, on the Stalingrad front, there appeared new types of airplanes, La-5. These machines, created by designer Lavochkin, had a powerful air-cooled engine and cannon armament. The emergence of new equipment entailed a change in the tactics of fighting fighters. Their combat order began to be echeloned by altitude. Height, speed, attack, fire, and again height. This is what became the formula for combat operations of Soviet fighters. Two-way communication between pairs and within the group, as well as with the ground, was also improved. But still there were not enough airplanes, and no tactical innovations could not compensate for the lack of material. Near the airfield worked women, cadets of military schools, men of non-conscription age. They were preparing new frontiers for our troops. Scorched by the sun, petrified earth was hardly yielding to shovels. But Stalingrad residents spared no effort, and, looking at the tired but continued to work hard people, we ourselves strived to do as much as possible to defeat the enemy. On August 19th, I was part of a group fighting with German fighters over Stalingrad. When the air battle started, the artillerymen decided to help us and fired a salvo. My plane was hit by an anti-aircraft shell and was shot down, and I was wounded and out of action for a considerable period of time. It was good that the wound was not heavy, and I was able to take part in fights with the enemy on the ground. After the Nazis came to the Volga, our aviation, which was based in Beketovka, Voroponovo and other airfields, was transferred to the left bank of the river. When the first massive attack on Stalingrad was made, I was in the hospital of watermen, and on crutches watched fascist bandits dropping bombs on the city. And on the night of August 23rd, 24, I managed to escape from the hospital. It was not easy. The hospital command received an order to evacuate all the wounded to Saratov. After all, in a week I will be healthy, I objected. Why take me to such a distance? Just so that you were healthy. I could not convince the medics. When they began to dress us, to take us to the steamer going to Saratov, I escaped at the right moment. Escaped, of course, very conditionally. You can't run on crutches. I just hid secretly. I immediately went to the division headquarters. However, before reaching the headquarters, I realized that I was late. Luckily, in the room was on duty Senior Lieutenant Abramov. "Where is the headquarters?" I asked. "On the left bank. I'll head there now." "Do you still have a connection?" "I haven't taken it off yet." "Let's call Kapustin's regiment." Abramov quickly turned the knob of the field phone, and in a couple of minutes said that my comrades in arms were on the left bank near the dairy farm. So we must get across the Volga, we decided. Having finished our business in the empty headquarters, and having taken the last telephone set, we set off. Sad was this night march through Stalingrad. The city did not sleep. Fires were burning everywhere. Residents were digging up victims in the ruins. Children were crying. A continuous stream of people was moving to the crossing of the Volga. Fascist mutilators, leaving the mutilated city alone for a while, bombed the crossing all night. Black, as if oily, water went in waves from explosions. And in the afternoon, Hitlerites shelled even steamships with Red Cross signs. The transports on which my recent hospital neighbours were transported came under the Nazi fire. German artillerymen shot the steamships by direct fire, and most of the wounded, along with the medical staff, were killed. The people at the crossing were numerous, no one prepared for the mass evacuation of people across the Volga. Soldiers of the commandant's service were knocked down, bringing order. The brutal bombing did not demoralize Stalingrad residents. The wounded, women and children were the first to be put on tugboats, boats and tugboats. There was no panic, although everyone, of course, wanted to get out of the burning city as soon as possible. A lot of time passed while Abramov and I moved to the left bank. There were already regulators on the roads and signs with inscriptions, "The farm of such and such." Several times, clarifying the location of the dairy farm, we reached the division headquarters on foot or by hitchhiking. During my stay in the hospital, the pilots of the regiment continued to fight hard. Many comrades were killed. With deep sorrow, I learned that in one of the battles died a hero's death, Pascual José. In his last battle, the brave Spaniard fought, indeed, like Serov. Pascual alone entered into battle with 5 Messerschmitts. Hitlerites, obviously, did not expect such audacity. Pascual José perfectly used the momentary confusion of the enemy. He set fire to one Messer with an accurate cue. Then again, gaining altitude, repeated the attack and destroyed another enemy aircraft. 3 Messers were shot down in this battle by my battle friend. However, his yak was engulfed in flames. Pascual jumped out of the burning machine, but, as it turned out, during the battle, the parachute opening cable was broken by a cue. At the front, we often lost battle friends. It is impossible to bear the death of comrades calmly. And if a friend dies as a hero in a difficult battle, it does not mitigate the grief of loss. Tension in the air every day grew. Air battles were non-stop. We had 2 pilots per plane, and this allowed us to maximize the use of available combat vehicles. In the air from morning till evening was heard the continuous roar of engines and machine gun bursts. Every now and then down fell Nazi planes. Fighting with the enemy, we were constantly improving the tactics of air combat, and especially the interaction between groups in the air and with anti-aircraft artillery. The entire flying staff carefully analysed the accumulated experience, developing new techniques and methods of air combat. This work was led by commanders, staffs, and political committees. Experience has shown that dense, closed battle orders constrain the actions of pilots and, moreover, give a significant advantage to the enemy. Echeloning in height to a certain extent modified the combat order in battle, but still absolutely positive results did not give. More and more new airplanes were arriving at the front. We understood with what incredible tension the workers of our aviation industry were working to make up for the equipment lost in the battles. In the first period of the war on the Bryansk front, we fought with single enemy planes or with small groups of bombers and fighters. The same situation was on other fronts. Then the tactics developed in the course of battles quite satisfied us. On the Stalingrad front, the Nazis fundamentally changed the tactics and principles of combat use of aviation. It began to operate mainly in large groups. The new situation required a rapid change in the forms and methods of fighting with enemy aircraft. During the dismantling of one of the battles in the air showed a group of Red Star airplanes. "Helpers are coming to us," said the regiment commander, Major Kapustin. "They will be based with us, and they came from near Moscow. Fighters one after another came in for landing. We carefully watched their actions on the smallest details to determine the degree of training of the pilot. Covering the landing was organised clearly, but here over the airfield appeared a pair of Me-109. The Germans at this time behaved quite brazenly. True, it was already the second echelon. Berlin Ace in 1941 ignominiously finished on Soviet soil his way to world domination, and they were replaced by untrained youths. Probably this explains the fact that the Germans did not risk to come closer. Having turned around, they quickly disappeared. Arrived Aviation Regiment was a well-organised team, had already had experience in combat operations near Moscow. It was commanded by an experienced officer, Major Naidenko. After landing, airplanes were dispersed on the airfield. Pilots, free from combat work, went to the new comrades to get acquainted and in the hope of meeting acquaintances. And so it turned out. Many of us immediately remembered Major Naidenko, who served before the war in our division as deputy commander of the Aviation Regiment. And who was this stocky, smiling pilot? Was it Verkozin? That's right, him. The last time we saw each other was in September 1941 at the Bryansk front, and almost a year later we met at the Stalingrad front. How dear such meetings are, how much joy they bring. We squeezed each other in our arms for a long time and repeated, "That's how we met. It is always a joy to meet a friend, and especially at the front." And the comrades who surrounded us rejoiced with us. We had a lot to remember. "How's your health, your mood? Where were you? What did you see?" Interrupting each other, we asked. "Since October 1941, I was near Moscow," Verkozin answered. "And how are you, Commander? Are you on crutches again?" These words sounded so sad that I hurried to interrupt Verkozin. "Nothing, my friend, we will still fight. We'll drive more than one Kraut into the ground." Then we remembered our comrades. I asked him if he knew where Resnik, Shabanov, Sidorov were, but he hadn't met anyone, hadn't seen any of them. Nor could I tell him anything about our former comrades in arms. The war had scattered us to different fronts. We would have talked some more, but we had to get down to business. When we met again, we talked about current affairs. Verkozin was interested in the habits of German pilots in the Stalingrad sky, and I tried to tell him everything I knew about the actions of German aviation. Major Naidenko asked our commander, Major Kapustin, to share with his pilots the experience of combat operations against the German fascist aviation. "Your experience will be very useful to us," emphasized Naidenko. Our wonderful commander did not need to be persuaded. He was gladly ready to pass all the knowledge and experience to his comrades in arms. That evening the pilots of both regiments gathered. Those who arrived looked at us as if we were oracles, ready to utter the immutable truth. Such attention embarrassed us. We realized that we had no right to deceive their expectations. Speaking pilots said, "First of all, remember, the highest vigilance, interaction, discretion in the air is necessary. The fascists are cunning, instantly use the slightest opportunity to attack. They have clearly worked out the interaction, and we need to learn it. Remember the golden rule. Everyone searches for the enemy, the leading men hit, the wingmen ensure their attack. How should it look in the air? The wingman covers the attacker and is always ready to fight the one who attacks the leading, and when the leading comes out of the attack, the wingman hits the enemy, the leading covers him. In the sky, you cannot improvise," we said. "All variants of search, rapprochement and combat should be practiced on the ground if possible. And one more thing, in battle, trust each other. Without this golden rule of success will not achieve all that we had accumulated, all the experience, paid for by combat labour and blood, we tried to pass on to our new friends, pilots. But we ourselves were constantly learning. In the army, as nowhere else, the rule is true. If you stop on the spot, you are behind. And if this requirement is obligatory in the days of peaceful training, then in war it is an immutable law." At the end of August, beginning of September 1942, we were especially concerned about interaction in battle, starting with a pair, a link, and in a group. The issues of air combat control from the ground also became acute. This idea seemed to be in the air, and it was enough indirect reason for everyone to talk about it. One morning, when I was wandering around the airfield with a stick looking longingly at the planes taking off, a car stopped near me. "Comrade Kozlov!" I turned around, quickly raised my hand to the visor. In the car sat the division commander Krasnoyarchenko. "How are you, Captain?" "Not good, Comrade Colonel. I want to fly," I frankly answered. The division commander waved his hands. "It's not in my power yet. Everything depends on your leg. But I can take you for a ride in a car. Sit down, let's go and see how ours are working on Stalingrad. And when you get better, you'll fly." I climbed into the back seat of the car, attached my wounded leg, and we quickly drove to the Volga. An observation point was set up on the bank. We approached. A group of commanders had already gathered there. One of them, Colonel Danilov, I immediately recognized. Before the war, he commanded our division. Arrived Aviation Regiment was a well-organized team, had already had experience in combat operations near Moscow. It was commanded by an experienced officer, Major Naidenko. After landing, airplanes were dispersed on the airfield. Pilots, free from combat work, went to the new comrades to get acquainted and in the hope of meeting acquaintances. And so it turned out. Many of us immediately remembered Major Naidenko, who served before the war in our division as deputy commander of the Aviation Regiment. And who was this stocky, smiling pilot? Was it Verkozin? That's right, him. The last time we saw each other was in September 1941 at the Bryansk front, and almost a year later we met at the Stalingrad front. How dear such meetings are, how much joy they bring. We squeezed each other in our arms for a long time and repeated, "That's how we met. It is always a joy to meet a friend, and especially at the front." And the comrades who surrounded us rejoiced with us. We had a lot to remember. How's your health, your mood? Where were you? What did you see? Interrupting each other, we asked. Since October 1941, I was near Moscow, Verkozin answered. And how are you, Commander? Are you on crutches again? These words sounded so sad that I hurried to interrupt Verkozin. Nothing, my friend, we will still fight. We'll drive more than one Kraut into the ground. Then we remembered our comrades. I asked him if he knew where Resnik, Shabanov, Sidorov were. But he hadn't met anyone, hadn't seen any of them. Nor could I tell him anything about our former comrades in arms. The war had scattered us to different fronts. We would have talked some more, but we had to get down to business. When we met again, we talked about current affairs. Verkozin was interested in the habits of German pilots in the Stalingrad sky, and I tried to tell him everything I knew about the actions of German aviation. Major Naidenko asked our commander, Major Kapustin, to share with his pilots the experience of combat operations against the German fascist aviation. Your experience will be very useful to us, emphasized Naidenko. Our wonderful commander did not need to be persuaded. He was gladly ready to pass all the knowledge and experience to his comrades in arms. That evening the pilots of both regiments gathered. Those who arrived looked at us as if we were oracles, ready to utter the immutable truth. Such attention embarrassed us. We realized that we had no right to deceive their expectations. Speaking pilots said, First of all, remember, the highest vigilance, interaction, discretion in the air is necessary. The fascists are cunning, instantly use the slightest opportunity to attack. They have clearly worked out the interaction, and we need to learn it. Remember the golden rule. Everyone searches for the enemy, the leading men hit, the wingmen ensure their attack. How should it look in the air? The wingman covers the attacker and is always ready to fight the one who attacks the leading, and when the leading comes out of the attack, the wingman hits the enemy, the leading covers him. In the sky, you cannot improvise, we said. All variants of search, rapprochement and combat should be practiced on the ground if possible. And one more thing. In battle, trust each other. Without this golden rule of success, we'll not achieve all that we had accumulated, all the experience, paid for by combat labour and blood, we tried to pass on to our new friends, pilots. But we ourselves were constantly learning. In the army, as nowhere else, the rule is true. If you stop on the spot, you are behind. And if this requirement is obligatory in the days of peaceful training, then in war it is an immutable law. At the end of August, beginning of September 1942, we were especially concerned about interaction in battle, starting with a pair, a link, and in a group. The issues of air combat control from the ground also became acute. This idea seemed to be in the air, and it was enough indirect reason for everyone to talk about it. One morning, when I was wandering around the airfield with a stick looking longingly at the planes taking off, a car stopped near me. "Comrade Kozlov!" I turned around, quickly raised my hand to the visor. In the car sat the division commander Krasnoyarchenko. "How are you, Captain?" "Not good, Comrade Colonel. I want to fly," I frankly answered. The division commander waved his hands. "It's not in my power yet. Everything depends on your leg. But I can take you for a ride in a car. Sit down, let's go and see how ours are working on Stalingrad. And when you get better, you'll fly." I climbed into the back seat of the car, attached my wounded leg, and we quickly drove to the Volga. An observation point was set up on the bank. We approached. A group of commanders had already gathered there. One of them, Colonel Danilov, I immediately recognized. Before the war, he commanded our division. Having detected enemy bombers southwest of the city, I immediately radioed it to Major Leshko, and one of the wingmen of his group reported that he could see the enemy. Toward the city were 20 bombers in a keel column under cover of 8 to 10 fighters, Mi-109 and Mi-110. Major Leshko reorganized his group for the battle and, dragging his wingmen away, went on the attack. The strike was so swift and unexpected that the enemy fighters, who were slightly above and behind, did not even have time to counteract. During the short battle, 10 enemy bombers were shot down, and the survivors, dropping bombs wherever they could, fled to the west. The regiment commander, having gathered his wingmen by radio, broke away from the enemy fighters and returned to the airfield without losses. Here appeared 12 enemy bombers under cover of 8 fighters, which went at an altitude of 800–1,000 metres. At that time, 8 fighters of the 629th Fighter Aviation Regiment on I-16 and I-153 airplanes were patrolling over Stalingrad. The group was headed by Lieutenant Baranov. Seeing enemy planes and my own fighters, I passed the data about the enemy to the leader of our group. Baranov immediately reported that he could see the enemy, and, despite the enemy's multiple superiority, rushed the whole group in a frontal attack. Breaking the line of bombers, skillfully manoeuvring and skillfully using machine gun fire and rockets, Lieutenant Baranov, together with his wingman, shot down 2 bombers. The rest, having dropped bombs in the vicinity of Mamayev Kurgan, hurried away. 8. Mi-109, emerging from the clouds, tried to attack Bernasian's group, but having lost 1 airplane at once, shot down by an accurate fire of rockets, again hid in the clouds, and did not resume attacks. Thus, Lieutenant Bernasian's group not only prevented the enemy from reaching the defended object, but also defeated the numerically superior enemy. The pilots of the 629th Fighter Aviation Regiment, despite the fact that they were fighting on obsolete aircraft, successfully covered our ground troops in the Stalingrad area and in Stalingrad itself, conducted aerial reconnaissance, stormed enemy ground forces. Skillfully applying maneuver and machine gun fire, they courageously fought air battles not only with bombers, but also with enemy fighters. Before me unfolded and the picture of land battles. In the blazing Stalingrad, where it seemed that everything was destroyed, all went and went, our soldiers. The troops were crossing to the western bank day and night. Sappers under continuous fire were building assault bridges, and reinforcements were rushing along them. Skittish boats were drifting from shore to shore. A barrage of enemy artillery shells and mines fell on the assault bridges and boats. The river was literally boiling with explosions. U-87 bombers were dive-bombing with howling. At times my heart clenched at the sight of what was raging in Stalingrad. But one had to look back, and it became easier. Here on the left bank suddenly appeared installations of Katyusha. On the horizon you see a sea of fire and a huge cloud of smoke from their volley. Just now German heavy mortars were firing at the crossings, but after the Katyusha hit, they fell silent. What a relief the Katyushas brought to the defenders of Stalingrad. I wanted to shout to the artillerymen, "Give more!" After the volley, the Katyushas immediately changed their firing positions. The Germans were terribly afraid of this formidable weapon and hunted for it at the same time. But the Guards' mortars were invulnerable. Being at the point of guidance, I carefully watched the actions of the pilots and especially those whom I knew. Junior Lieutenant Verkozin was growing up day by day before my eyes. His Red Star Hawk bravely rushed at the enemy. The pilot acted skillfully, calculatingly. His combat account was growing day by day. In a short period of time he destroyed 7 Nazi airplanes. It was a pleasure to watch Verkozin fighting. A real air fighter. Major Leshko spoke about him with respect. I also watched Verkozin's last battle. It was in the first half of September. In a fierce air battle pursuing U-88, Verkozin lit it on fire and drove it into the Volga. But when he was coming out of the attack, he was attacked from above by Mi-109. Verkozin's wingman could not help him. So the heart of the fearless fighter pilot stopped beating. At the debriefing, they repeated again and again how important it was in the battle to ensure a clear interaction between each other, how necessary to understand each other and react as quickly as possible to changes in the situation. But Verkozin was no longer among us. And one more tragic picture I happened to observe in those days. My great friend, Squadron Commander Alexander Maslenikov, died before my eyes. He had to fight with a superior group of the enemy, trying to strike at the crossing. One had to look beyond the Volga as the heart began to clench, a sea of fire, clouds of smoke, rising to a height of 3 or more kilometres. It was hard to even imagine that in this hell, somewhere in the ruins of houses, there were people. But they were not only there. They were fighting the enemy, stubbornly defending every house, every floor. Well, how could we, pilots, could not do everything in our power to help the defenders of Stalingrad? Here we did not think about the numerical and technical superiority of the enemy. To detect and to beat him mercilessly. That's what all our thoughts were directed to. Here and Sasha Maslenikov with his wingman rushed into battle, not caring that he was putting himself under a deadly blow. In a fierce battle, having shot down one Mi-110, with his wingman Junior Lieutenant Ivanov, again rushed into the attack, but immediately a couple of enemy fighters attacked them from above, and Sasha Maslenikov's plane, engulfed in flames, crashed into the ground. The fearless Falcon died for the motherland on the bank of the great Russian river Volga. The victory at Stalingrad came at a high price, and celebrating every year the next anniversary of the defeat of the Nazi hordes on the banks of the Volga, we will never forget the fallen heroes. Their beautiful life was as bright as the eternal flame burning on the mass grave of the defenders of Stalingrad on Mamayev Kurgan. The 102nd Fighter Aviation Division of Air Defence, from the beginning of hostilities at Stalingrad, and until October 1942 covered Stalingrad and the fighting order of the troops in close cooperation with the front aviation and anti-aircraft artillery. The pilots of the 102nd Fighter Aviation Division fought most intensely against the enemy aircraft in July, August and September 1942. During these 3 months, they made more than 10,000 airplane sorties, conducted 376 single and group air battles, and shot down 318 fascist planes. For the bravery shown in the battles with the German invaders, for the organisation, fortitude and heroism of the personnel of the 102nd Red Banner, Fighter Aviation Division of Air Defence by the order of the Commissar of Defence, No. 145, was transformed into the 2nd Guards Stalingrad. Red Banner Fighter Aviation Division of Air Defence. Of the division's units, the most intense fight against enemy aircraft was fought by pilots of the 629th Regiment. This regiment made more than 5,000 combat sorties during the battle, conducted 139 air battles and shot down 104 enemy planes. Brave masters of air combat grew up in the regiment. Lieutenant F. Fedorov, the commander of the Link, defending the sky of Stalingrad, shot down 12 enemy planes on the plain. I-16, Lieutenant E.V. Evseev, 8, Petty Officer V. P. Smirnov, 6, P. Smirnov, 6, Petty Officer Ershov, 8. All of them became heroes of the Soviet Union. Fighter pilots of the 788th. Fighter Aviation Regiment were the first in the division to open the account of Nazi airplanes' destruction. On January 1, 1942, Sergeant Y.V. Lyamin on the plane Yak-1 by the method of ramming shot down a German bomber U-88. In July and August, the pilots of the regiment were the first to take the brunt of the fight with enemy fighters for air supremacy. In addition to the direct task of defence of Stalingrad, the regiment covered the troops on the battlefield and performed aerial reconnaissance. Bravery, courage and combat skill in air battles with the enemy showed the pilots of the regiment. The military commissar of the 3rd Squadron, hero of the Soviet Union, political officer V.F. Bashkirov, who shot down 7 Nazi planes in air battles during the defence of Stalingrad, the hero of the Soviet Union, the commander of the 3rd Squadron, Senior Lieutenant G.K. Gultyev, with the air battles in the defence of Stalingrad. K. Gultyev, who shot down 18 enemy planes, hero of the Soviet Union, Major V. G. Kamenshchikov, who shot down 5 enemy planes, Captain M.A. Chumakov, who shot down 14 enemy planes, and many others. The troops of the Stalingrad Corps Air Defence District and units of the 102nd Fighter Aviation Division of Air Defence played a significant role in the fight against enemy aircraft and ground troops during the Battle of Stalingrad. Conducting exceptionally intense battles, they shot down 688 enemy planes from July to December 1942. For courage, fortitude and combat merits in the battles for Stalingrad, the Stalingrad Corps Area of Air Defence was awarded the Order of the Red Banner by the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. As soon as I finally recovered and was preparing to get back into a combat vehicle, I received an order to transfer me from Stalingrad to the command of the commander of the Fighter Aviation Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel A.A. Tereshkin. In vain, Colonel Krasnoyarchenko petitioned to keep me in Stalingrad. The command of the Fighter Aviation of the Air Defence Forces repeated the order, and I had to go on the road. It was hard to leave Stalingrad. I could not understand why exactly I had to leave in the midst of fighting in the most decisive at that time. It was as if I had no provinces, everything was going well. But on arrival at the regiment I was convinced how far-sighted the command had been in making such a decision. I was assigned to a new fighter aviation regiment. At that time it was just being formed. Pilots, technicians arrived at the location of the regiment. Behind the shoulders of air fighters was a rich combat experience. All pilots had passed the harsh front school in the skies of Moscow, Polar region, Stalingrad, Voronezh. It was immediately clear to us that the regiment is intended to solve responsible tasks. This was confirmed by Colonel General Gromardin and Lieutenant General of Aviation Osipenko, who soon visited us. They said that we should as soon as possible organize the regiment into a combat unit in order to go to Stalingrad as soon as possible. "You have all the data for this," the commander admonished us. The generals knew what they were saying, and we saw that the regiment was composed of experienced pilots who had already been thoroughly shelled. Rare air fighter did not have a government award. On the chest of Lieutenant Colonel A.A. Tereshkin sparkled Order of Lenin. The same high award had the Deputy Squadron Commander P.I. Shavurin, who rammed the German bomber U-88 near Gorky. Orders of the Red Banner, Red Star, medals were awarded to many pilots and technicians. Commissar Skudin, Chief of Staff Major Burdev, Deputy Commander Major Kostigov were like Tereshkin. The first squadron was commanded by Captain S.G. Ivanov, previously fought in the Arctic Circle. He was a specialist in night fighting. Defending his native Moscow, grew into a first-class pilot and leader, Squadron Commander Captain Konstantin Potapov. The third squadron took me. Already the first acquaintance with the personnel confirmed that General Osipenko carefully selected each pilot. Shavurin, Ivanov, White, Babich, Yeldyshev, Ivlev, Karev, Shkuropy and other pilots of the third squadron, like the pilots of the first and second, were true masters of manoeuvre and fire. But in order for the regiment to become a fighting unit, it was necessary to fly, to work out interaction. In short, it was necessary to create a solid team, to recognize each other. By the end of September, the regiment was fully staffed with personnel. The matériel began to arrive. First, the first and soon the second squadrons received Yak-7B fighters. The flights began, but our squadron was still horseless. "The third squadron," the pilots said resentfully. "It always gets everything in the last turn." But this time the third squadron was unexpectedly lucky. We received not Yak-7B and airplanes Yak-1B, characterized by higher tactical and technical data. Now the pilots of the first and second squadrons began to consider themselves offended. Some hot-headed comrades even reproached us for dishonesty. What could we say to them? In order not to add fuel to the fire, we preferred to keep silent, although in our hearts everyone rejoiced that our squadron was so lucky. In the early days of October, we flew closer to Stalingrad. A few days after our arrival came the order to allocate a group of fighters to cover the unloading of troops. 8 of our Yaks was headed by the deputy commander of the regiment, Major S. Kostigov. Not an hour after landing, as at the station Baskunchak, where there were several echelons with troops and equipment, there was a bombing raid. Major Kostigov quickly took the 8 into the air. Fighters boldly rushed at the enemy. The fascists, not flying to the target, began to drop bombs indiscriminately. 2 Junkers were destroyed. S. Kostygov's airplane was damaged in the battle. The courageous pilot on the burning fighter tried to ram the enemy, but he failed. He had to jump with a parachute. Kostygov was badly burned and out of action for a long time. This is how the first battle ended. The first misses showed that although the pilots of the regiment were quite experienced, but their experience was not properly generalized, issues of organization of combat and especially group combat were still poorly worked out. The fact is that the pilots of the regiment were collected from different fronts, and the conditions of military operations, say, in the Arctic Circle, differed from the conditions near Moscow. What did we do in order to consolidate the links, squadrons, and the regiment as a whole into a fighting unit? First of all, the commanders were engaged in a thorough study of each pilot individually. The strengths and weaknesses of air fighters, their knowledge of their airplanes, knowledge of the enemy were revealed. During this period, I received invaluable assistance from the squadron Commissar Miroshnichenko and my deputy P.I. Shavurin. We should not forget that the described events took place in October 1942. The whole country followed the heroic defence of Stalingrad with excitement. Pilots were raring to go to the front, and they were almost put behind a desk. Every now and then, one and the same question was heard: when to the front? And Miroshnichenko patiently answered the pilots, explaining our tasks. And in the evening, when we happened to be left alone, Miroshnichenko, as they call it, exploded. "How long can we sit here? It's time to go to the front." "You told the pilots yourself." I didn't know what I said. And having calmed down a bit, he added, "In my mind, I understand that it's too early for us to go to the front, but my heart can't stand it." And who had it in those harsh days? Was it easy, having mastered the airplane Yak-1B and making sure that it is in no way inferior to the Nazi Messers, still stay in the rear? But it was necessary. It was necessary for the front, for the coming battles and victories. The pilots of our regiment, mastering the Yaks, could not be pleased with the excellent machine. Excellent visibility, high speed, excellent maneuverability, armament. Everything indicated that it was a formidable weapon. Comparing the capabilities of Yak with the performance of Nazi fighters and bombers, we worked out in advance the most rational forms and methods of fighting the enemy aircraft in a variety of conditions. A great benefit was brought by the Conference of the Flying Staff, held on the initiative of the regiment command. The regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel A. Tereshkin himself, was engaged in its preparation. He outlined the issues to be discussed, personally talked to the pilots who were assigned to make reports. Almost all of them spoke. Captain Stepan Ivanov, his namesake Viktor Ivanov, Senior Lieutenant White and Junior Lieutenant Pasyuk, who came to the regiment from the Murmansk area, shared their experience of combat operations in the Arctic Circle. Captain Potapov and Junior Lieutenants Yeldyshev and Ivlev talked about the peculiarities of fighting near Moscow, as reflected the raids of Nazi bombers on Gorky, said Senior Lieutenant Shavurin. Those who came to the regiment from near Stalingrad told about the air battles over the heroic city. All the speakers came to one conclusion: the experience gained in the fierce battles, in hard work, to use as much as possible, to multiply the glorious combat traditions and never retreat from them. At flight briefings, party and komsomol meetings. In intimate conversations, we summarized the results of this painstaking work. Briefly but clearly formulated the laws of air combat, steadfastly and accurately carry out the combat order, shield the enemy and be the first to impose a fight on him. Act and win, not by numbers, but by skill. Go fearlessly to victory, despising death. Perish yourself and save your comrade. Don't leave your target until you've destroyed it. Keep your airplane safe. And when everyone spoke, and the regiment commander summarized the results, everyone had the opportunity to draw conclusions about the actions of the Nazi Air Force on various fronts from Stalingrad to the Arctic Circle. It was as if we had read an encyclopedia about air battles on the Soviet-German front. About a month, the regiment remained in reserve. During this time we retrained, polished tactics, paying special attention to free air battles. We mastered flying at night, and then came the order to relocate to the Stalingrad area and promptly join the 16th Air Army, which was commanded by General Rudenko. 2 days before the flight of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Tereshkin called the navigator of the regiment, Captain Nikolai Grishkov, and me. Inviting us to the map, Tereshkin said, "We are ordered to relocate to a new airfield. Here." The pencil of the regiment commander stopped on the bend of the blue line marking the Don River northwest of Stalingrad. "You should," continued the commander, "now get ready and fly to reconnaissance of the airfield. Clarify what is available at the airfield to support the regiment, to solve the issues of organization, of reception and accommodation of the regiment with the division commander." We went outside, looked at the sky as if we had never seen it before. In the area of our airfield, the weather was unfavourable. The height of the lower edge of the clouds was less than 100 metres. Thick haze covered the horizon. Visibility did not exceed 1.5 kilometres. "What a weather!" Grishkov spat. "And how on the route?" "Let's go to the meteorologist." Duty meteorologist reported that the entire route 10-point cloud cover, the lower boundary of clouds no more than 100–150 metres, horizontal visibility to 2 kilometres. "Well, namesake, can we manage?" "Let's try," I agreed. We took off from the airfield on the airplane UT-2. We flew up to the Volga in relatively decent conditions, but the further we went, the worse it became. The thing is that the right bank of the Volga is much higher than the left one, and we had to gain a safe altitude. But as soon as we did that, the airplane was in a thick haze. Continuing the flight at extremely low altitude, we expected that in 10–15 minutes we would get out of the haze. But it was getting thicker and finally turned into a solid fog. The airplane started icing up. Only then we decided to go back. But the return was not easy. The airplane was iced over, the propeller was covered with ice, the engine began to shake, and with such force that it seemed that it was about to break away from the under-engine frame. With the stopped engine, we had to land in a clear field. However, we got off, as they say, with a slight fright, if not to count the strong bruises we received. We scolded ourselves for our rash decision. But no matter how much you curse, it doesn't help. You step a little bit, and go into the snow up to your waist, raise your head. You can't see anything. Leaving the airplane, we walked along the field. In 2–3 hours we got out on the road, and only by the end of the day we reached our airfield. They came to Tereshkin, reported how everything happened. They wanted, they said, to fulfill the task by all means. But here, wanted too, boiled the regiment commander. It's not enough to want, you need to know how. Have you forgotten that there are bad weather conditions? Drained us on all articles. And it was worth it. In fact, we made a grave mistake. Having received from the commander of the regiment the appropriate indoctrination, we began to fulfill our duties. There were only hours left before the flight of the regiment. The next day, our regiment, having made a farewell circle over the airfield, took a course to Stalingrad. In the most difficult days, when, not counting losses, the enemy was attacking Stalingrad with countless forces, when this beautiful city was burning and under the hail of enemy bombs turned into ruins, we did not lose confidence in victory. Sometimes it was difficult, our comrades were killed, inhuman strain of strength was required, but there was no room for cowardice and confusion in the hearts of the soldiers. We firmly knew, we will endure. The Soviet people, soldiers of the country of Soviets, brought up by the party, will not give up Stalingrad, will defend their native Volga. To crush the enemy, to destroy him mercilessly, to avenge his despicable crimes. This is what every frontline soldier lived by. The fierce hatred of the enemy poured out in fearless feats. Black swarms of fascist vultures ceaselessly circled over Stalingrad, showering it with bombs. With what fiery fury we rushed into battle. Courage, fortitude, courage of our soldiers could not be broken. They stood by the Volga River in a firm determination to die, but not to retreat. And the day came when the enemy trembled. At Stalingrad began the offensive of the Red Army. Happiness and pride filled the hearts of those who had the honour to be the defenders of Stalingrad, to be a participant in the great heroic battle, unprecedented in the history of wars. We waited for this day. We believed in it. We gave all our strength and were ready to give our lives for it to come. For the realization of these great tasks, we were ready to fight to the last drop of blood. The bulletins of the Soviet Information Bureau still reported there were no significant changes at the front. But we already knew that on November 19th, our troops had launched a decisive offensive at Stalingrad, and the Soviet army was surrounding the enemy troops who were bogged down in the city. This joyful news, which we had been waiting for so long, encouraged us, called us to new victories over the enemy. One after another, airplanes landed on the airfield, from which we will smash the enemy. Around our new airfield, to the horizon, stretched a flat, snowy field without a single tree or bush. Without wasting time, we equipped living quarters. Everyone worked: pilots, technicians, mechanics. There was built one dugout for each squadron. They were to rest in them between combat sorties. We were tasked to cover the attack aviation and troops on the battlefield, as well as the railroad main line Borisogledsk, Stalingrad, to conduct reconnaissance. By this time, the air supremacy was completely transferred to our aviation. The 16th Air Army had in service new perfect combat airplanes designed by Yakovlev and Lavochkin. When the ring of encirclement of the enemy grouping closed, for its supply of the German command was thrown transport aircraft. But due to heavy losses, the Germans abandoned this idea and kept in touch with the encircled group in difficult weather conditions, hiding in the clouds or single planes at night. The forces of the 16th and 8th Air Armies, in close cooperation with anti-aircraft artillery, was organised air blockade of the grouping. Thus, the attempt of the Nazi command to assist her from the air failed. We searched for the enemy in the air and on the ground, and as soon as found, destroyed. So it was with Focke-Wulf Condor, flying from the Stalingrad cauldron. It was discovered by our pilots White and Ivlev. It was not difficult to shoot down such an airplane, but it was very difficult to detect it. Focke-Wulf was camouflaged and piloted by an experienced crew. The Nazis cleverly used the terrain and chose a route where a meeting with our aircraft was very unlikely. And when he was shot down, it became clear why the crew of the plane flew with such precautions. It was fleeing from Stalingrad, 4 generals and 23 officers. After the first attack of our fighters from the Focke-Wulf, separated 4 points. Soon in the sky blossomed 4 parachute domes. This generals were leaving the doomed plane, but they failed to leave, and Focke-Wulf continued to fly. Again the attack. Brave pilots are firing from a minimum distance. Exit from the attack and the enemy plane, falling apart in the air, crashed into the ground. All parts of the front quickly learned about the feat of our fighting friends. The front commander, Army General Rokossovsky, awarded White and Ivlev with the Order of the Red Banner. The command of the encircled enemy group sent a Junkers 88 airplane for reconnaissance. It went to the northwest along the railroad Stalingrad, Borisogledsk. Hitler's pilots were very careful. They flew at a height of more than 7,000 meters, and all the time tried to stay so that in case of danger to go into the clouds. Having noticed the enemy plane, Shavurin quickly went to approach and opened fire. Junkers, shooting back, at maximum speed went with a gain in altitude, and there are clouds. There is no time for aiming fire, a few more seconds, and the enemy will go away, will hide in the clouds. Soviet pilots have another weapon, a ram, the ram. Pilots all over the world have admirably appreciated this type of aerial combat, which requires iron courage and great skill. Only Soviet falcons, inspired by love for the motherland, bravely go to this risky business and come out victorious. They know one thing: to beat mercilessly vicious enemies. Peter knew what a battering ram was. In the summer of 1942, he destroyed an enemy bomber with a ram near Gorky. The ram is the highest expression of courage, will, and selflessness. And Shavarin gave gas. Blow. Junkers, falls apart. Damaged yak entered a steep spiral. Overloads pinned Peter to the seat, but the pilot's mighty strength and will saved him. Shavarin managed to break the lantern and left the plane. He landed in the neighbourhood of Kikvidze. A little time passed, and on the chest of 23-year-old Peter, Shavarin, next to the Order of Lenin, received for the first ram Sparkled Award and for the second feat the Gold Star and another Order of Lenin. Peter's award rejoiced the whole regiment. Most of all, of course, was happy with the culprit of the celebration. Peter was a good and cheerful comrade. Every evening, having taken a guitar, together with his friend Viktor Babich, he delighted our ears with wonderful Ukrainian songs. These days he sang especially inspirationally. In the dugout, when, in the iron stove crackling logs, Shavarin and Babich often performed a very popular at the front song, Zemlyanka. Other pilots joined them, comrades from neighbouring squadrons came, Winter Day is Short. In addition, the weather often did not allow to take to the air in the daytime. In such cases, as well as in the evening, the whole regiment gathered at the school, where we had dinner. After we had front 100 grams, we started joking and singing. Of course, it was not vodka that lifted our spirits. The pilots drank it based on the principle, if it was supposed to be drunk, it should be drunk. The organizer of the improvised amateur art was Captain Grishkov. He himself composed songs and ditties, and he composed right here in the dining room. As soon as he uttered one quatrain, the continuation came from all sides. Creativity was in the full sense of the word collective. In ditties told about the successes, about the failures of individual comrades. Grishkov had a whole complex of talents. He not only sang and composed ditties, but also drew, designed a wall newspaper, combat leaflets, which were very popular. It is necessary to note a characteristic feature of all our amateur activity. Everyone was eager to contribute, not waiting to be a sked. Everything was done from the hiat. Well, who say agitated P.E., Shavarin and V. Babich to sing? No one. They themselves, feeling the need, realizing how important it is to raise the mood and morale of comrades, took a guitar and sang. In the battalion of airfield maintenance, the same tireless Grishkov found one soldier who played the accordion wonderfully. Later, when the regiment relocated, the pilots kidnapped this soldier. So he, together with the regiment, and flew from place to place. The laurels of the soldier bayonist did not give rest to the pilot Pasyuk. He, at the first opportunity, bought a harmonica in the military store, got a self-teaching. Barely a free minute begins to squeeze the same melody. His desire to learn to play was great, but his ability to do so, as they say, was not detected. And so Pasyuk bored everyone with his tedious melody that the pilots, half jokingly, half seriously, began to wish that the harmonica hit a bomb. "Then you would stop tormenting us," said comrades. And Pasyuk, smiling slyly, replied, "You just envy. Time flies imperceptibly. In the circle of comrades sometimes even forgets that we are at the front. And only the commissar of the 3rd Squadron, Miroshnichenko, is always on the alert. From time to time he goes out on the porch and listens to the silence, occasionally interrupted by distant artillery shots. Miroshnichenko unmistakably determined the approach of enemy planes. "They are flying from Vyoshenskaya," he calmly said, entering the dugout. The pilots went out on the porch. They listened. Nothing. "You imagined it," someone said to Miroshnichenko. "Listen better." And again everyone fell silent. A minute passed, another, and the rumble of enemy airplane engines was heard by all. What ears? Sound catchers. And Miroshnichenko, without wiping off the calm smile from his face, said, "Let's go." And we headed for the plains. The fighters on duty, scattering a fan of snow, had already left for takeoff. Until our friends returned, no one left the airfield. We stared intensely into the evening gloom, and when the sky was coloured by bullet trails, we waited breathlessly for the end of the battle. In the winter of 1942-43, the meteorological situation in the Stalingrad area was difficult. Because of it, the machines sometimes did not go up into the sky for 24 hours. It was very annoying that in one of the most intense periods of the Battle of Stalingrad, when Manstein's group was desperately trying to rescue the Nazis surrounded in the city, we, pilots, could not help our ground troops. Next to the airfield was an artillery unit. Somewhat aside, there was a Guards mortar regiment, our glorious Katyusha. We often visited the artillerymen, asked them about the power of fire, which they can rain down on the enemy, admired the Katyusha, lamented their fate. Now we could fly and fly, but here we sit like a cursed one. Nothing, the artillerymen consoled us. We'll manage here ourselves. We'll give the Krauts some fire. And there will be work for you. And there was indeed work. If the pilots had brakes, our technicians and mechanics never knew peace. To keep all aircraft in constant combat readiness, military technicians Tkachenko, Zhdanov and others did everything they could. The situation forced sometimes to resort to absolutely unthinkable in normal conditions, things. For example, Viktor Ivanov returned after the battle. On the planes of his plane need to fix the holes. In normal conditions it is done very simply. Percal patches are put on the holes. But to glue them on, you need the right temperature. And how to create it in the frost. So, instead of gluing percale, our aviation specialists froze it. They poured water into the hole and put the percale on. The water quickly froze, and the ice seized the patch. Having read such a story, everyone who is familiar with aviation technology will say, "This is barbaric." True, of course, our technicians understood it well. But what else could they do? Monstrous, from the point of view of a peacetime specialist, methods used by our mechanics and technicians had one significant advantage. The airplanes flew. And not only flew, but were quite combat ready. And this is more important than all the instructions and manuals which cannot foresee everything that happens in war. And was it easier for our radio specialists? To ensure clear and smooth operation of radio stations, it was necessary on the ground not only to repair and adjust them, but also to check them. And again the question, how to do it. After all, except for low-power batteries, there were no aerodrome means of checking at our disposal. We had to start the engine of the airplane and use it to check the radio. One can imagine what it was like for the radio technician when the thermometer showed -40 and the wind from the propeller blew literally through the air. And yet, thanks to the efforts of radio technician Nikolai Vasilievich Zhdanov and his assistants, the radios worked perfectly. For us, pilots, difficult weather conditions brought additional rest, and on aviation specialists, they imposed additional difficulties. A lot of trouble caused them and supply problems. The regiment was tasked with intercepting airplanes travelling at high altitude. For high-altitude flights needed oxygen. However, those supplies that were available, we quickly used up. Our technicians had to go to neighbouring regiments which did not need oxygen and beg for it. Once Zhdanov, having loaded the car with empty cylinders, went to a neighbouring fighter regiment. When they left, the weather was more or less normal. But on the way, it started to blizzard, and what a blizzard it was. The driver lost his way and drove the car at random. It was white all around, and there were no landmarks. We were driving, and suddenly a fighter in a white camouflage coat rises in front of the car. "Where are you going? Are you crazy? Germans are 200 meters away." If this fighter had not been on the way, our comrades would have fallen into the clutches of the enemy. When Zhdanov, having returned to the regiment, told us about this case, he was making jokes as usual, trying to present what had happened as a funny incident. But in war, such incidents often cost lives. Kolya Zhdanov was an inexhaustible joker, and now, being already a colonel, he never forgets a joke when we meet. Our fellow soldiers still remember one funny moment. We met the New Year 1943 in a solemn atmosphere. We read out congratulations from the Military Council of the Front, the commander of the army. When we had a drink or two, Petya Shavurin came up. "Comrades pilots, engineers, technicians, what would you like now?" Restless Zhdanov shouted, "Supplements." The new year started well. We got the news that fresh units were arriving at Stalingrad. "Soon the Krauts will be finished," we said. The encirclement ring was getting tighter and tighter, and it was clear that the days of Paulus's group were numbered. One evening, having talked enough about the glad tidings from the front, we went to bed. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. At first it was not boldly, and then it banged imperiously. We jumped out of bed, being careful. Without lighting the fire, we went to the door. "Who is there?" Miroshnichenko asked. "Open up, my dear. It's theirs." We turned on the light, opened the door. Several big guys entered the room. White camouflage coats, tightly encased warm cotton coats. In the hands of the soldiers were black automatic rifles. "No other way than Siberians," Shavurin suggested. "Exactly. And who will you be?" "Pilots." The soldiers immediately became embarrassed. "You'll forgive us for disturbing you. We didn't know." "Why are you apologizing?" Miroshnichenko interrupted them. "Well, how could I? You must have worked so hard during the day. You need to rest. You should rest too. We'll sleep in a haystack. We're warmly dressed. We won't get cold." To make it convincing, the soldier who was speaking threw back the floor of his camouflage coat, showed his cotton pants and stomped his footshoed in a felt boot. The Siberians reached for the exit, but we persuaded them to stay with us. "Give it up, guys!" Shavurin put his arm around the shoulders of the two soldiers in front of him. "You still have to spend many nights in the cold. Make yourselves comfortable." And although the room was not big, a dozen soldiers we settled down for the night. Our friends who lived in other houses also welcomed the infantrymen. And could it be otherwise? Surrounded fascist group was living its last days. With what we could, we helped the ground troops. We flew assaults, conducted reconnaissance, intercepted enemy planes that were communicating with the troops of Paulus. The units were working hard to prepare personnel for new battles. A huge mobilization role was played by the appeal of the Military Council of the Front. Here it is. "Glorious soldiers of the Soviet fatherland, the hour has come for the final defeat and destruction of the encircled German grouping at Stalingrad." We patiently waited for a prudent decision of the command of the encircled German troops to stop senseless resistance, guaranteed all those who surrendered to preserve their lives. German fascist bandits did not want to lay down their arms. They still count on the help promised by Hitler. And since so, when the enemy does not surrender, he is destroyed. To the victorious, decisive battle, dear comrades. Military Council of the Front. Order to the troops of the Don Front, number 26, of January 9th, 1943. Political workers familiarized literally everyone with the appeal. In the words of this document, which called for a decisive blow to the enemy, soldiers and officers drew confidence in the full success of the struggle. Solving jointly combat tasks, we with tankers, artillerymen, infantrymen on maps practiced the most likely variants of joint combat operations to destroy the encircled group. On February 2nd, the unparalleled Stalingrad epic ended. The enemy was defeated, over 200,000 soldiers, officers and generals of Hitler's army were captured. The Soviet people and its armed forces, under the leadership of the Communist Party, inflicted a heavy defeat on the German fascist troops in the grandiose battle on the Volga River. This was a historic stage on the way to the victory of our motherland over Nazi Germany. In this battle, which took place on a vast territory between the bend of the Don and the Volga, the Soviet army, as a result of many days of fighting, stopped the main strike group of the enemy and, going on the counter-offensive, laid the foundation for the mass expulsion of the Nazi invaders from the borders of our country. Our regiment was relocated to Borisogledsk. We were instructed to cover the railroad junction. Staying in Borisogledsk coincided with a memorable event for us. It was February 14th. In the evening after dinner, we sat at home, talking, remembering the war days, relatives. Military technician Zhdanov was fiddling around the receiver. Today he promised to arrange for us to listen to the latest news. Zhdanov kept his word. The voice of our native Moscow burst into our house. How joyful it was to hear the report of the Soviet Inform Bureau, which listed the settlements recaptured from the enemy. Having listened to the bulletin, we immediately began to mark on the map where our troops had advanced. Everyone started talking at once. "Quiet!" Suddenly we heard Zhdanov's voice. "They are transmitting the decree on awarding the title of Hero of the Soviet Union to pilots." We fell silent. It's nice to hear that our comrades are being honoured with the highest award of the motherland, but what we heard, none of us expected. The announcer read the names: Koblov Sergei Konstantinovich, Kozlov Nikolai Alexandrovich, Peter Ivanovich Shavurin. And no sooner had the announcer finished reading the signatures under the decree than our friends rushed to us and began to congratulate us. Soon after the rise, a rally was held in the regiment. The command of the division came. When the regiment was built and in front of the line appeared the battle flag of the regiment, the commanding officer Colonel Kostenko ordered pilots Koblov, Kozlov and Shavurin to get out of formation. We carried out the command. The division commander read the decree and gave us congratulations from the commander of the air defence forces of the country, Colonel General Gromodin, and the front commander, Army General Rokossovsky. The cold wind was getting under the hem of my leather raglan, which had been with me through the battles in which I had been shot down at Bryansk. The left floor was scorched, the elbow of the right sleeve was stitched. Looking at the raglan, I remembered my fighting way from Baranovichi to Borisogledsk. Our comrades came out. We, all three of us, vowed to smash the enemy even more decisively, sparing no effort for victory. "Thanks to the party, the people," said the awardees. "We will justify the great honour which was awarded to us by the motherland." A few days later, our regiment received a new task: to participate in the battles for the liberation of Kharkov. Then there were Kursk, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Berlin. After reforming and receiving new aviation equipment, the regiment from January 1942 fought near Moscow, then participated in the battles at Kursk-Bulge, near Smolensk, in Belarus, East Prussia. Since April 1943, the regiment took Major Kolomin, a participant in the battles with the White Finns, who by that time had 4 downed enemy aircraft, awarded the Order of the Red Banner and Red Star. He was a skillful leader, an excellent fighter pilot, an outstanding organizer who earned great authority and love of comrades. The commander was rightfully a leader in combat work, personally led groups of planes on a mission. Every day the number of downed enemy planes increased. Shoot down airplanes pilots Gribov, Adolf, Seroglasov and others. In a combat situation does not stop for a minute party work, held a flight tactical conference and a number of other activities that contributed to the improvement of flying skills, especially young pilots. The technical staff did a great job. Within 3 days was thoroughly inspected and repaired the material part. In May 1943, when the regiment was on the airfield, it was visited by the commander of the 1st VA Lieutenant General of Aviation Gromov. On June 12th, the regiment began combat operations in the Orlovsko-Bolkov operation. The first to open the account of downed enemy planes in this grandiose operation were Captain Gorakov, Junior Lieutenants Shegolev and Morozov, who in one battle shot down 3 aircraft FV-1T and did not let the attacking attack aircraft which were escorted. At that time, the tension of combat work was great. Each pilot made 3-4 sorties a day, but people did not reckon with any difficulties for the sake of victory. Captains Gorakov, Adolf, Afonin, Toponkin, Senior Lieutenants Sikhev, Baranovsky, Alexeyev, Lieutenant Minarsky and young pilots Ermakov, Gafanov, Mishko were especially distinguished in combat work. The technical staff lived on the airfield, in huts, under the planes, excellently prepared the material part, skillfully repaired damage received in air battles. The samples in work showed Senior Technician Lieutenant Vanin, Technicians Lieutenants Tobolev, Sukhovarov, Juba, Petty Officer Kolody and others. The party and Komsomol organizations worked promptly. Those who distinguished themselves in the battles were accepted into the party and Komsomol. Visual agitation talks about the best technicians, pilots, specialists, combat leaflets, mobilized people to successfully perform tasks. Many were awarded orders and medals. Till the 1st of August, 1943, on the Orlovsko-Bolkovsky direction, in persistent and fierce battles, the pilots shot down 35 planes of the enemy, having lost 4 of their own. The regiment made 493 combat sorties. Here are just a few combat episodes, the most characteristic. On January 12, 1943, 6 Yak-7, led by Captain Adolf, accompanied the attack aircraft on the direction of the breakthrough of enemy defences in the area of Ulianovo, during the attempt of fighters FV-190 to attack the attack aircraft. An air battle ensued. With a decisive attack, Captain Adolf shot down 1 FV-190. The other 8 left the battlefield. On July 13, 1943, 6 Yak-7s under the command of Captain Gorakov engaged in air combat with 4 FV-190s and 2 Mi-109s. In this battle, 3 enemy planes were shot down. On July 4, 1943, Lieutenant Minarsky's scout wing, while carrying out a reconnaissance mission against enemy troops near Gizdra, met 2 groups of Ju-88s with 9 planes each. Lieutenant Minarsky was the first to shoot down a Ju-88, and after him the second Ju-88 was destroyed by Lieutenant Sikhev. The remaining 16 Ju-88s dropped their bombs haphazardly and went back. On the same day, a group of 10 Yak-7s of Captain Gorakov, escorting the attack aircraft, engaged in combat with 12 FV-190s, destroyed 2 enemy aircraft and ensured the fulfillment of the task by the attack aircraft. The regiment fought similar battles several times a day, but August 12, 1943 was one of the most intense days. The unit shot down 23 enemy aircraft. The commander took the groups on missions 4 times, and the pilots were invariably successful. The battles were observed by the deputy commander of the 1st VA, who gave high praise to the pilots. The pilots participating in these battles were presented to government awards. The news about the success of the unit travelled all over the front. Front newspapers wrote about the pilots, their experience. They placed photos of the masters of air combat Kolomin, Afonin, Adolf and Gorokov. Above the photos, a large inscription: "They shot down 57 German planes." Many air battles took place in full view of our ground troops. Observing them, soldiers and officers admired the actions of pilots, and in case of concrete manifested their love for them. So it was August 12, 1943, when a brave 10 Yak-7, under the command of Major Kolomin, engaged in an air battle with 20 Ju-88 and 16 FV-190. In this battle, the enemy bombers were not allowed to reach the target. They dropped bombs on their troops and, in addition, 5 enemy planes were shot down. Our group skillfully completed the task, but misfortune befell Senior Lieutenant Alexeyev. His plane was set on fire by a thermite shell, and the pilot had to leave the burning plane by parachute. Burnt, he landed on a neutral strip. Our fighters decided to save him. 7 men jumped out of the trench, grabbed Alexeyev, and under the hurricane fire of the enemy carried him to the shelter. At the same time, 3 fighters were killed. Young pilot Gabdullah Gafanov made a feat in these days, performing one of the missions to cover the ground troops and seeing that the enemy was attacking his commander, Captain Afonin. Gafanov, unable to attack the enemy, blocked the way with his plane and was set on fire. But the hero saved the life of the commander, who continued to manage the battle. The regiment took part in the fight for the liberation of Smolensk. It was shot down 20 enemy airplanes. During this period, our troops again went on the offensive and chased the enemy in the direction of Orsha, Mogilev. A new stage of the regiment's combat work began, the fight for the liberation of Soviet Belarusia. On the Orsha direction, the enemy introduced the best forces, represented by the fighter squadron Melders and other selected units. Serious air battles broke out, February 23, 1943. On this memorable day, the regiment was awarded the Red Banner, and our staff did not shame the shrine. The unit in 1943 conducted 146 air battles, as a result of which 144 enemy aircraft were shot down. 4,603 combat sorties were made. In 1944, the regiment conducted combat operations in the Orsha and Vitebsk directions. On January 1, 1944, during a reconnaissance flight, the famous pilot of the unit, the commander of the 2nd Squadron, Captain Gorokov, was killed by barrage fire. Modest, silent in everyday life, Captain Gorokov, transformed in the air, became a true storm for the fascist vultures. He was always looking for a fight with the enemy. 23 downed enemy planes testify to his high skill. The Soviet government highly appreciated the combat work of pilot Gorokov, awarding him the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. On June 23, 1944, the regiment began the most active actions in the Belarusian operation. In some days, there were 100 to 120 combat sorties. For excellent actions during the breakthrough of the enemy's defence on the Pronya River and mastering the city of Mogilev, the regiment was twice noted in the Order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Following the advancing ground troops, the regiment flew to a field airfield south of Minsk, but during the fighting, the airfield was attacked by an encircled group of Germans. Such a situation more than once forced after a mission to storm in the area of the airfield groups of the enemy, accumulated for attacks. Subsequently, seeing the organised defence of the airfield, the Nazi soldiers began to surrender as prisoners. Separate groups of soldiers and officers were fished out by the soldiers of the regiment. In the battle for the city of Grodno, many air battles were fought. Dozens of enemy planes were shot down. The part deservedly received the name Grodno. In the battles for the city of Volkovisk, Army newspaper in August 1944 wrote, "An anti-aircraft shell exploded under the plane of the Ilyushin. The fragments damaged the machine, and it began to lag behind. This was noticed by the commander of the escort group, Lieutenant Suni Oglu. Handing over the command to his deputy, he alone remained with the hit-attack aircraft." A few minutes into the flight, Suni Oglu was attacked simultaneously by 4 FV-190s. On converging courses, in pairs, from above and below, the Germans were approaching. They decided, probably, to shoot down our fighter first, and then to deal with the attack aircraft. The numerical superiority of the enemy did not break the will of Suni Oglu. He decided to protect the attack aircraft at any cost. Making a steep slide, the brave pilot slipped out from under the blow of the top pair. The Germans skipped close by. Throwing the machine in a dive, Suni Oglu was the first to open fire on the lower pair of the enemy, cut it off, and again approached the attack aircraft. The second and third attacks from the top of the enemy's second pair were unsuccessful. Yak dodged the slide, and, coming out of it with a combat turn, found himself at short range with one of the Fokkers. Suni Oglu's shot put an end to the German machine. He left the battle when the attacking aircraft was out of danger. So ended the unequal battle of one Yak with 4 Focke-Wulfs. For successful combat operations, by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on August 2, 1944, the unit was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. The regiment participated in the battles to liberate the Polish people from the Nazi invaders. For the mastery of the cities of East Prussia, the regiment was again honoured with the gratitude of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Senior Lieutenant Bader, Captain Anosov, Junior Lieutenant Goryunov, Senior Lieutenants Bakirev, Belusov, Pakhomov, Korshunov, Markovich and others were distinguished by their assault actions. After the liquidation of the Danzig Cauldron, the regiment took part in the final defeat of the Nazi invaders. In the battles for Stettin and Svinemünde, the regiment is again noted. It was awarded the Order of Suvorov, 3rd degree. Together with the entire Soviet people with great enthusiasm, the personnel of the regiment met the Great Victory Day. During the Patriotic War, the regiment made 8,593 combat sorties, shot down 201 enemy airplanes. The regiment gave the country heroes of the Soviet Union, Major Y.I. Gorokhov, Captain S. Kiselev, Lieutenant Colonel P.I. Kolomin, Lieutenant Colonel N.M. Onopchenko. The regiment was awarded the Order of Suvorov, 3rd degree, the Red Banner of Combat, and the Medal for the capture of Königsberg. Many important facilities, the tractor factory, Red October and Barricadi plants and others, were located in the northern part of the city. Large objects were in the centre of the city and in its southern part, in the areas of Beketovka and Krasnoarmysk. The northern group of objects was separated from the border of the southern ones by about 60 kilometres. This required a peculiar construction of anti-aircraft artillery grouping. The multi-kilometre strip of the city, stretching along the right bank of the Volga, was divided into 7 combat sectors, directly adjacent to each other. The basis of air defence in each sector was an anti-aircraft artillery regiment of medium calibre. Fighter aviation intercepted and destroyed enemy aircraft on the distant approaches to the city. Anti-aircraft artillery provided on the near approaches of the circular coverage of urban objects from the attack of enemy aircraft. It bore the brunt of the fight against the air enemy at night. Anti-aircraft searchlight units created a circular light zone for night firing of artillery and for fighter aviation. When the enemy in July, August pushed our troops, the Corps units received new additional tasks. During this period, an anti-aircraft group was formed to cover river transports on the Volga, and anti-aircraft artillery regiments to fight against tanks were assigned batteries of 76 mm field guns. Later, in September and October, anti-aircraft artillery, part of the forces, covered from the air and supported in the fight against the ground enemy main forces of the 62nd Army, leading defensive battles in the city. This task was performed by a specially formed anti-aircraft group under the command of G.I. Ershov. The main forces of anti-aircraft artillery at that time covered the crossings across the Volga, near the city and south of it, as well as the grouping of artillery batteries of the front on the left bank. In November, the Corps units took an active part in the air blockade of the encircled enemy. The aviation regiments of the 102nd Fighter Aviation Division had a very difficult and complex task. In addition to the main tasks of frontline aviation, they covered their troops, escorted bombers, often stormed field airfields and ground troops of the enemy. Management of the units also varied depending on the situation. The main means of communication in the conditions of the Battle of Stalingrad was radio, as wire communication often failed. However, some commanders did not take this into account and did not properly engage in training radio operators, did not know how to competently use radios for battle management, and, as a consequence, when reflecting the first enemy air raids, the transition to radio communication caused great difficulty. This gap had to be eliminated in the course of intense fighting. In the initial period of the Battle of Stalingrad until August 23, 1942, when there were persistent battles with the ground enemy on the distant approaches to the city, the enemy aviation mainly conducted intensified reconnaissance along the main railway lines to Stalingrad from Kamyshin, Povorino, Morozovskaya, and Kotelnikovo, as well as military-industrial facilities of Stalingrad and its air defence system. Reconnaissance was carried out mainly from an altitude of 5,000–7,000 metres by single aircraft of the He-111 and Ju-88 types. At that time, the enemy's bomber aviation was actively providing the offensive of its troops on the Don frontier, made group bombing raids on crossings across the Don, on airfields and railway stations. Parts of the Stalingrad Corps air defence area destroyed enemy reconnaissance planes, reflected group bombing raids, and in some cases took part in battles with the ground enemy. The first bombing raids on Stalingrad were undertaken by the enemy at the end of July 1942, in groups of 20-45 aircraft at an altitude of 2,000–5,000 metres. These raids were made sporadically, and anti-aircraft artillery relatively easily repelled them, preventing the enemy from dropping bombs on the defended objects. During this period, in very difficult conditions, had to operate fighters 102nd Fighter Aviation Division, as the 8th Air Army had not yet arrived. Most of the units of the 102nd Division had in service obsolete types of aircraft I-16, I-153, and the flight crew for the first time participated in aerial combat. Front aviation, with which the division interacted, was also not strong enough. Therefore, naturally, the flying staff was not sufficiently trained in tactics and techniques of air combat, especially group combat, and the command staff had insufficient experience in organising air battles.